She sat across from a stranger, hands wrapped too tight around a menu she wasn't reading, heart doing that familiar thing it always did right before someone left. He could walk out. They always did. But tonight, something was different. She just didn't know it yet. And when the man from her past walked through that door, lips curled into the smile she still saw in nightmares, everything she had spent 3 years rebuilding was about to be tested in front of a room full of strangers. Drop a comment with your city. Let's see how far this story travels. The phone call that started everything happened on a Tuesday, which Adrian Cross would later decide was fitting, because Tuesdays were the most unremarkable day of the week, and nothing about that call felt remarkable at the time. He was in the middle of signing off on a quarterly report when his assistant knocked. 3 sharp raps, which meant it wasn't urgent, but also wasn't something she planned to let slide. He waved her in without looking up. "Your brother called again," she said. "Which one?" "Daniel." Adrian set the pen down. Daniel was the one who called about real things, not business. The other 2 called when they needed something. He reached for his phone and dialed back before she'd even left the office. "Before you say anything," Daniel started, "just hear me out." "That's never a good beginning." "There's someone I want you to meet." Adrian leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling. He'd heard this exact sentence 4 times in the past 2 years, and each time it had ended the same way, with a woman who was perfectly fine, genuinely lovely, and completely wrong for the chapter his life was currently in. The last one had spent most of dinner asking about his portfolio, not his investment portfolio, his art collection. "Daniel, she's not like that. You said that last time." "I was wrong last time. This time I'm right." "How do you know her?" There was a pause that lasted exactly 1 second too long. "Through Maya's co-worker. She's a friend of a friend kind of thing." "So you don't actually know her?" "I know enough. She's good people, Adrian, and you've been working every weekend for 8 months. Marcus asked me last week if you actually live at the office." Adrian said nothing. Marcus was 7 years old and apparently had opinions. "He's 7, Adrian said. "He's 7 and he notices. Come on, 1 dinner. If it's terrible, you leave. No pressure." The ceiling offered no useful advice. Adrian thought about the stack of work waiting on his desk, about the conference call he had at 6 the next morning, about how the last time he'd sat down to dinner without thinking about something work-related, Marcus had been maybe 4 and still small enough to fall asleep against his shoulder in the car. "1 dinner," he said finally. "1 dinner," Daniel confirmed, and Adrian could hear the smile in it. The restaurant Daniel chose was called Marigold. It was the kind of place that managed to feel intimate without being pretentious. Low lighting, tables spaced far enough apart that conversation stayed private, a menu that changed with the season. Not flashy, not trying too hard. Adrian appreciated that. He'd eaten in enough rooms that were trying too hard to last a lifetime. He arrived 7 minutes early, which was his default. Being late to things felt disrespectful to him in a way he'd never quite been able to articulate, so he simply didn't do it. The host led him to a corner table and he ordered water and told himself he'd give it 2 hours, be polite, and go home. He was checking his watch, not from impatience, just habit, when he looked up and saw her coming through the door. She wasn't what he'd been picturing, though he couldn't have said exactly what he had been picturing. She was maybe 5'4" in shoes that looked like they'd been polished carefully, but were still showing their age at the heels. Her dress was navy blue, simple cut, the kind of thing you bought because it worked for every occasion and you needed things in your wardrobe that worked for every occasion. Her hair was dark, pulled back loosely, with a few pieces that had escaped and she hadn't bothered to fix. She was scanning the room with the kind of careful, quiet attention that people developed when they'd spent a lot of time in rooms where they weren't sure they belonged. When her eyes found him, something crossed her face that he couldn't immediately name. Not excitement, not disappointment. Something steadier and more guarded than either of those things. She walked over. He stood. "Emily?" he said. "Adrian." She said it the way you say the name of a person you've rehearsed meeting. She shook his hand, firm, brief, professional, in a way that felt slightly out of place for a date, but also somehow honest. "It's nice to meet you. You too. Please, sit down." She sat across from him, and for a moment they both looked at their menus with the focused energy of two people trying to seem more at ease than they were. "So," she said. "So," he said. "I want to say something before we start," Emily said, setting the menu down. She looked at him directly, and there was something almost rehearsed about the words, like she'd been practicing them in the car. "If I'm not what you were expecting, you're free to go. I won't be offended." "Well," she corrected herself, mouth tightening slightly. "I'll probably be a little offended, but I'll survive it." Adrian looked at her for a moment. "What makes you think you're not what I was expecting?" "I just know how these things usually go." "How do they usually go?" She picked up her menu again. Men see the picture, they agree to dinner, they show up and realize the picture didn't tell the whole story, then they spend most of the meal looking for a polite exit. "I don't have a picture of you," Adrian said. "Daniel didn't send one." Emily blinked. "He didn't?" "He said, and I'm quoting, 'Trust me.'" Something shifted in her face. Not quite a smile, but the thing that happens just before one. "That's either very considerate or very suspicious." "Knowing my brother, it's both." She almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. The waiter came and they ordered Chet. She took a moment longer than him, reading the menu carefully, and he noticed she ordered the second cheapest entree, not the cheapest. He'd seen people do that before, not the ones who didn't want to look like they were watching the prices, but were absolutely watching the prices. He ordered the same thing, even though he'd been considering the lamb. What? The conversation started the way first date conversations always did. Careful, surface level, orbiting around facts rather than truth. She worked at a nonprofit that provided after-school tutoring to kids in lower-income neighborhoods. She'd been there 4 years. Before that, she'd done a stint at a retail job she described as educational in the worst possible way. And before that, she'd put herself through 2 years of community college before the money ran out. "And you just stopped?" he asked. "I didn't stop. I just paused." She turned her fork over in her hand. There's a difference. Like, stopping is a decision. Pausing is what you do when life doesn't give you the space to make a decision. "And you're still paused?" "I'm unpausing," she said. "Slowly. Night classes, when I can afford them." He nodded. He didn't say anything about it being admirable, because people who were actually living hard things didn't usually want to be told how admirable they were for surviving them. It just felt like more distance. "What about you?" she asked. "Daniel told me you have a son." "Marcus, 7 years old, completely convinced he's 40. She did smile then, a real one, small but genuine, and it changed her face in a way that was slightly startling, not because she suddenly became something she hadn't been before, but because you could see what she looked like when she wasn't guarding herself. "What's he like?" "Opinionated, very serious about snacks. He told me last week that my cooking was acceptable but not exciting, and I've been thinking about it ever since." She laughed, a short, surprised sound, like she hadn't planned on it. "He sounds like a food critic." "He's been watching too much cooking TV, honestly. He asked me why I don't plate things properly." "And do you?" "I put the spaghetti on the plate. I don't see the problem." She was smiling into her water glass now, and Adrian noticed that when she was amused, she looked down, like she was a little embarrassed to let people see it fully, like smiling was something she'd learned to do quietly. "His mother?" Emily asked, and then immediately shook her head. "Sorry, I don't know why I asked that." "It's fine," he said. "She left when Marcus was 2. It wasn't dramatic, just we weren't right for each other, and she was honest enough to say so before Marcus got older, and it got harder to leave. I respected that, even though it didn't feel great at the time." "Do they have a relationship, her and Marcus?" "Not really. She moved overseas, she sends cards on his birthday. He reads them and then puts them in a drawer, and we don't usually talk about them unless he brings it up." "Does he?" Adrian thought about it. "Sometimes. He asks questions more than he asks to see her. He's more curious about who she is than whether she's there, if that makes sense. Smart kid. He figures out what he needs." Emily was quiet for a moment. "I was like that," she said. Then she seemed to catch herself, like she'd offered something she hadn't meant to. "Sorry, I don't usually—" "You don't have to apologize," he said. You were like that how? She set her fork down, looked at the table. My dad left when I was 9. I used to make up reasons for it in my head that had nothing to do with me, because the ones that did have to do with me were too much to carry around. She paused. I figured out pretty early that waiting for people who were gone was a waste of time better spent on people who actually stayed. The table went quiet in a way that wasn't uncomfortable, which was unusual for a first date. Usually quiet meant something had gone wrong. This felt more like two people just occupying the same space for a moment without needing to fill it. That's a hard thing to figure out at 9, Adrian said. It's a harder thing to unfigure out at 30, she replied, and picked her fork back up. What Adrian noticed about Emily Carter across the space of that first hour was that she was funny in a way she didn't seem entirely aware of. It came out sideways, in observations delivered deadpan, in small self-corrections that were more honest than most people's prepared statements. She was quick, and she had clearly learned to be quick, the way people did when they grew up in environments where you had to hold your own or get talked over. But there was also something careful running underneath all of it, like a hand on a railing. She was measuring things, testing the air before she breathed it. He'd met a lot of people with money and a lot of people without it, and he'd learned that the difference usually showed up not in what people said, but in how they relaxed. Or didn't. People who'd spent years being financially precarious had a specific kind of tension in them that never fully went away, not even in good moments, because good moments had taught them that the floor could drop out at any time and you should probably keep your weight balanced. Emily had that tension, not obviously, but it was there. Can I ask you something? She said, somewhere around the midpoint of their entrees. Sure. Why are you still here? He looked up from his plate. We haven't finished eating. That's not what I mean. She set her elbows on the table, which was not proper dinner etiquette, and she seemed not to care. You're clearly doing fine for yourself. You're not hard to look at. You seem like you have options. Why are you on a blind date set up by your brother? Because my brother is annoying and persistent. That's the reason you came. Why are you still here? He thought about the honest answer, which was, because this is more interesting than I expected. He said a version of that. Because you told me I could leave, he said, and that was the most interesting way anyone's ever started a conversation. She stared at him. That's a weird reason. Most people spend the first half of a first date performing. He tilted his head. Opened with the exit, like you were trying to skip to the part where I left. Something flickered across her face. Maybe I was. I know, he said. That's what made it interesting. She held his gaze for a moment, and he could see her trying to figure out what to do with that answer, whether to believe it, whether it mattered if she did. I've been on a lot of dates, she said finally, where the person was very enthusiastic at the beginning, and then I mentioned something about where I live, or that I'm taking night classes, or that my grandmother and I share an apartment because neither of us can afford to not. And the enthusiasm she made a slow deflating gesture with one hand. How many is a lot? Enough to stop being surprised by it. She picked up her water glass. People have a type they're looking for, and when you don't match it, there's usually a polite excuse around the time the check comes. I'll call you. And they don't. Or sometimes they do call just to... She stopped. Just to what? She shook her head slightly. Some people think that a woman in my situation should be grateful for whatever version of attention they're willing to offer. Like I should be less selective because I have less. She said it flatly, not with self-pity, and that flatness was somehow worse than self-pity would have been. It was the tone of someone describing a fact about the weather. That's a specific kind of terrible, Adrian said. It's a specific kind of common, she replied. He thought about how to respond to that, and then decided not to try to fix it with words. Some things didn't need a response so much as they needed to just be heard and not immediately argued with. So he just nodded and refilled her water glass from the small carafe on the table because it was almost empty, and it was something to do with his hands. She looked at the refilled glass and then at him, and he had the distinct impression she wasn't used to small, unremarkable gestures from people who didn't want something back. They'd moved past the entrees and were in that in-between stretch of a dinner when neither person wants to be the first to suggest dessert or the check, because suggesting the check means the evening is over, and suggesting dessert means you're admitting you want it to continue. And both of those things require a degree of vulnerability that first dates don't usually have built the infrastructure for yet. Emily was telling a story about one of her tutoring kids, a 10-year-old named Jerome, who had decided that mathematics was a conspiracy against people who were good at other things. And she was doing it with her hands, gesturing in a way that she probably didn't notice, but that made everything she described more vivid. She was laughing a little as she told it, and the laugh was unguarded this time, and it sat differently on her face than the earlier almost smiles had. So I told him, she was saying, I said, Jerome, math isn't a conspiracy, it's just a language, and all you have to do is learn to speak it. And he looked at me for a very long moment. She stopped. Not because the story was over, because something behind Adrian had pulled her attention and everything in her face changed at once, quickly and completely, the way a door slams shut in a sudden wind. Adrian didn't turn around immediately. He watched her instead, and what he saw was this. The color left her face in a specific way, not like embarrassment or shock, but like recognition. Like seeing something you'd hoped you would never see again and finding out, despite all that hoping, that the world doesn't much care what you hoped. Her hands, which had been animated and moving a moment ago, went still in her lap. Emily, he said quietly. I'm fine, she said, before he'd even asked. That was a lie, and they both knew it, but he let her have it for a moment. He turned then, casually, like he was just looking around the room. The man was maybe 40, wearing a jacket that was doing a lot of the work of his personality for him. Expensive, deliberately casual in the way that costs money to achieve. He had the look of someone who'd decided early in life that confidence and certainty were the same thing, and had never been sufficiently corrected. He was with two other people, a woman draped on his arm like an accessory she was happy to be, and another man who was already laughing at something that hadn't happened yet. And he had spotted Emily. The smile that appeared on his face was the kind of smile that had nothing to do with happiness. It was the smile of someone who has just located an opportunity they hadn't expected. He said something to his companions and started toward their table. Emily sat very still. You know him, Adrian said. It wasn't a question. Yes, she said. Do you want to leave? She looked at him, and there was a moment, brief, complicated, where he saw her weighing something. Then she straightened in her chair just slightly and shook her head. No, she said. I'm not leaving. He nodded once. Okay. The man reached their table. Emily Carter. He said it like her name was a punchline he'd been waiting to deliver. I'll be damned. I didn't think a place like this was your usual scene. Devlin? She said. The word came out level. It cost her something to make it level, but she did it. Devlin looked at Adrian with the particular evaluation that certain men applied to other men, cataloging, measuring, looking for hierarchy. Friend of yours? This is Adrian, Emily said. Devlin extended his hand to Adrian with the handshake of someone who used handshakes to demonstrate things. Devlin Marsh, Emily and I go way back. Not that far back, Emily said. Far enough. Devlin's attention shifted back to her, and the social performance of it fell away slightly, revealing something underneath that was harder and less pleasant. You look good. Better than I expected, honestly, given... He let the pause do the work. Everything. Given everything, Emily repeated. Still in that neighborhood? What is it, over by, I'm having dinner, she said. Of course, of course. He held up a hand as if she'd been the one being rude. I won't keep you, it's just... And here the smile came back, aimed at Adrian now, including him in something he hadn't agreed to be included in. Emily and I have a history. She was with me for a while back when... Another pause, another calculated beat. Back when we were in a different place in life. Circumstances change, you know how it is. Adrian looked at him. He didn't say anything yet. I moved on, Devlin continued, warming to the performance now. And I think Emily had a harder time with that than... That's not what happened, Emily said. The levelness had a different quality to it now, not forced, precise. Devlin tilted his head with the expression of someone very practiced at appearing reasonable. Emily, you told me in front of 6 people at a dinner that I wasn't invited to but showed up at anyway because you asked me to, that you couldn't be with someone who brought so little to the table. Those were your exact words. She wasn't raising her voice. If anything, it was quieter than it had been all evening. You said it like you were doing me a favor by being honest. And then your friends laughed. The table went completely quiet. Devlin's smile didn't disappear. It just got colder. That's a very specific memory for something that happened 3 years ago in March, Emily said. On a Thursday. You were wearing a gray shirt with the sleeves rolled up, and you'd ordered the salmon. Silence. Some things, she said, you remember in detail whether you want to or not. Devlin looked at her for a moment with something that might have been surprise, or might have been the thing that came just before cruelty, when cruelty realized it was being refused an easy target. He glanced at Adrian again. Adrian, who had been entirely still throughout all of this, met his eyes and said nothing. He simply looked at him with an expression that was completely calm and completely clear and left Devlin very little to work with. There was a moment. Then Devlin straightened, patted the back of an empty chair near their table in a gesture that meant nothing, and said, "Well, enjoy your dinner," and walked back toward his own table. Neither of them watched him go. Emily looked down at her water glass. Her hands were in her lap. A muscle in her jaw moved once. "Jerome," Adrian said. She looked up. "The kid who thinks math is a conspiracy. You were telling me about him." She stared at him. "You want to—" He looked you dead in the eye and said all of this, or was it more of a side glance thing? Emily blinked. Something in her face shifted. Not all the way, but a degree or two, like a door that has been held shut against pressure, slowly releasing a fraction. "Dead in the eye," she said. "Jerome does nothing halfway." "I respect that in a 10-year-old, Adrian said. She was quiet for another few seconds. Then she said, "I told him that math was a language, and he looked at me for a long time, and then he said," her voice was almost steady. He said, "Miss Emily, I already speak 2 languages, and neither of them got me anywhere." Adrian winced. "That's devastating." "It wrecked me," she agreed. "I couldn't argue with him. I just sat there." "What did you do?" "I went home and researched like 40 different ways to make fractions make sense and came back the next week with graph paper and food analogies." She paused. "He got a B on his last test." "There it is," Adrian said. She almost smiled. Then it landed slowly and stayed. Outside the window beside their table, the city was doing its evening things. Taxis moving, lights changing, people heading somewhere or heading home. The restaurant hummed around them with the sound of other people's evenings. Emily looked at him across the table, and something in her expression was different from what it had been an hour ago. Not open exactly, but less defended, less like a door that had been latched so long it had forgotten what it was for. "Why did you stay?" she asked. "Just now. You could have said something, or—" "You didn't need me to say something," he said. "You handled it. You were just—" She searched for the word "there." "Yeah," he said. "That's usually what staying is." She looked at him for a moment longer than felt entirely comfortable, and he didn't look away from it. "The dessert menu," she said finally, "is probably good here." "I was just thinking the same thing," he said, and they stayed. The check came later than it needed to, which neither of them acknowledged. Adrian paid it without discussion, not as a power move, but simply because he was reaching for his wallet at the same time she was reaching for her purse, and he was closer to the folder. She looked like she was going to say something about it. "Don't," he said, not unkindly. She closed her purse. Outside, the evening air had the particular quality of early fall, cool without being cold, carrying just enough bite to make you notice it without needing to do anything about it. The street was still busy with that mid-evening energy that cities have when the dinner crowd and the going-out crowd are both moving at once. They stood on the sidewalk outside Marigold, and for a moment it had the feeling of a thing that wasn't quite over but didn't quite know how to continue. "I'm that way," Emily said, gesturing left. "The bus stop." "I'll walk you," he said. "You don't have to." "I know." She didn't argue further. They started walking, and the distance between them on the sidewalk was the distance of 2 people who hadn't decided yet where they were in relation to each other. "Can I ask you something?" he said. You can ask. What were you like before all of it? Before the things that made you tell a stranger he could leave before dinner started? She was quiet for a step, 2 steps, 3. The bus stop was at the end of the block. Louder, she said finally. I was louder. More. She made a vague gesture with one hand. Out there. I used to have opinions about everything, and I'd just say them. I used to walk into rooms like I had a right to be there. What changed? Enough things. Enough times. She said it simply, not with bitterness, which somehow made it more affecting. You stop walking into rooms like you belong when enough people make it clear that the room is already full. The bus stop appeared. They stopped. For what it's worth, Adrian said, you walk into rooms like you belong. You just think you don't. She looked at him sideways. You're not a very realistic person. I'm extremely realistic, he said. I've just been paying attention tonight. The bus appeared 2 blocks away, its lights visible, moving toward them at the steady pace of city transit. I had a better time than I expected, Emily said. She sounded like someone making a confession. I want to be clear that I didn't expect much, so that's not... I knew what you meant, he said. Me too. Yeah? Yeah. The bus arrived, brakes sighing, doors folding open. She stepped toward it and then turned back, and the look on her face was complicated in a way that he found, inexplicably, more interesting than a simpler expression would have been. The kid, he said. Jerome. What about him? Tell him the conspiracy theory is wrong. Math is just the universe explaining itself badly. She stared at him for a beat. Then she stepped onto the bus, and the doors folded closed, and Adrian stood on the sidewalk watching the taillights diminish down the street. He stood there a minute longer than was necessary. His phone buzzed. Daniel. How'd it go? Adrian put the phone back in his pocket without answering and turned toward where he'd parked his car, 3 blocks away, in a lot that cost more per hour than most people made in a morning. He thought about a woman who ordered the second cheapest thing on the menu and polished shoes that were showing their age. He thought about the way she'd said, I'm fine before he'd asked, and the way her hands had gone still. He thought about a man in an expensive jacket who had once made her the punchline of a dinner she hadn't been invited to, and how she had sat across from that man 3 years later and recalled the exact color of his shirt. He thought about the question she'd asked him, why did you stay? And how the honest answer was more than one thing. And he hadn't said any of it because there was a difference between a first dinner and an honest conversation, and he had enough sense to know where that line was. But he thought about it. He got to his car, sat in the driver's seat, and didn't start the engine for a full minute. Then he took his phone out, went to his brother's text, and typed, fine. He thought about it another second and added, good, actually. Daniel's response came in under 10 seconds. A single thumbs-up emoji, which was uncharacteristically restrained, which meant Daniel knew exactly what that meant and was smart enough not to say it. Adrian put the car in drive. The city moved around him, lit and ongoing, full of its ordinary, extraordinary evening life, and somewhere on a bus heading toward a neighborhood he didn't know yet, Emily Carter was probably sitting very still, hands in her lap, turning something over in her mind the way people do when something unexpected happens, and they're not entirely sure what to do with it. He understood the feeling. He drove home. The week after the dinner at Marigold, Emily did not think about Adrian Cross. She told herself this very firmly on Wednesday morning while she was making coffee in the small kitchen she shared with her grandmother in the apartment where the second burner on the stove had stopped working 8 months ago and the landlord kept saying he'd send someone. She thought about it again on Thursday while she was on the bus to the tutoring center, watching the city slide past the window in its gray and ordinary morning way. She thought about not thinking about it on Friday when Jerome got a problem right on the first try and looked at her with the stunned expression of someone who had discovered a useful skill they didn't know they had. She was not thinking about him at all, except that she was. And the fact that she was annoyed her in a specific way because she was not a person who made a habit of thinking about men after single dinners that led nowhere. She had trained herself out of that particular habit a long time ago. The same way you trained yourself out of checking your phone for a text that wasn't coming. You just stopped expecting. It was easier. The problem was that Adrian had not fit neatly into the category she'd built for men who showed up to dinners like that. He hadn't performed. He hadn't made a point of being impressive. He'd refilled her water glass without making it a moment, and when Devlin had shown up wearing his expensive jacket and his rehearsed cruelty, Adrian had simply sat there, steady and quiet and present in a way that had bothered her more, in retrospect, than anything Devlin said. Presence was harder to dismiss than performance. She was thinking about this, definitely not thinking about it, on Saturday afternoon when her phone rang with a number she didn't recognize. She almost didn't answer. Unknown numbers were usually someone trying to collect something or sell something, and she'd had enough of both lately. But something made her pick up. "Is this Emily Carter?" "Depends on who's asking," she said, which was something her grandmother had taught her and had stuck around as a reflex. "This is Adrian." A pause. "From the dinner, Tuesday." She sat down on the edge of her bed without deciding to. "I know which Adrian." "Right. Okay." He sounded slightly less put together than he had at dinner, which was interesting. "I got your number from Daniel, who got it from Maya, who I'm told got permission from you. If that chain is wrong and this is a problem, tell me now." "It's not a problem," she said, and hated how quickly she said it. "Good. I was wondering—" Another pause, shorter this time, like he was making a decision mid-sentence. "Whether you wanted to get coffee sometime. Not dinner, just coffee. Lower stakes." Emily turned that over for a moment. Lower stakes. Like he'd thought about the stakes of dinner and determined they might have been miscalibrated. "When?" she said. "Whenever works for you. I'm flexible on days." "You run a business," she said. "You're not flexible on days." "I can move things," he said, and she believed him, which was the part that was hard to know what to do with. They settled on the following Tuesday, which made her think about Tuesdays being the most unremarkable day of the week, and whether he would agree with that assessment, and then she caught herself thinking it, and closed the thought down firmly. After she hung up, she sat on the edge of her bed for another minute, phone in her lap, listening to her grandmother moving around in the kitchen on the other side of the thin wall, the familiar sound of cabinet doors, and the kettle that had a particular whistle when it was almost at full boil. "Emily," her grandmother called. "Yeah." "Were you just on the phone?" "Yes." "With who?" There was a version of this answer that was simple and would lead to no follow-up questions, and a version that was accurate and would lead to at least 45 minutes of her grandmother's specific brand of interrogation, which involved asking questions that sounded casual but were actually structured like a cross-examination. "Someone I met last week," she said. A pause from the kitchen. Cabinet closed. "A man, someone, or a regular someone?" "Grandma." "I'm just asking." "A man, someone," Emily said, because lying to her grandmother had never once worked in 30 years, and she'd stopped attempting it around age 12. The kitchen went quiet for a moment in a way that meant her grandmother was smiling to herself and choosing not to let Emily see it. "You want tea?" "Sure," Emily said. She put her phone face down on the bed and stared at the ceiling, which had a water stain in the corner that was shaped, if you looked at it the right way, like a running dog. She looked at it the right way. She thought, this is probably nothing. She thought, good. She thought, despite herself, Tuesday. The coffee on Tuesday happened at a place called Birch and Ground, which was small and slightly worn at the edges in the way that places become when they've been around long enough to stop trying to look new. It had mismatched chairs and a chalkboard menu and light that came through the front windows in a way that made everything look slightly more thought through than it was. Adrian was already there when she arrived, which she'd half expected. He had the punctuality of someone who considered being late to things a personal failing. He was at a corner table, not the same instinct for corners that she had, which was about finding exits, but something similar in structure if different in origin. He had a coffee already, and a second cup waiting across from him, which she recognized as either presumptuous or considerate depending on how you felt about it. She sat down. "You ordered for me." "I asked for whatever you'd probably want, and they said oat milk latte was the most popular order, and I figured—" He stopped. "If that's wrong, I'll get you something else." She looked at the cup. Oat milk latte was exactly what she would have ordered. "It's fine," she said. "You're doing the thing where you say fine, but your expression is doing something else." "I don't have an expression." "You have several," he said. "You just don't notice them." She picked up the cup to have something to do with her hands. How's Marcus? Currently obsessed with a documentary about deep-sea fish. He came to breakfast this morning wanting to tell me about anglerfish, and I wasn't mentally prepared for it. Anglerfish are terrifying, she said. That was essentially his point. He seemed to find that comforting. 7-year-olds are correct about a lot of things, she said. They are, he agreed, and absolutely insufferable about it. She smiled, and this time she let it stay on her face without looking away from it. Something about the second meeting made the work of guarding herself feel slightly more optional, which was not a comfortable feeling, but was, she acknowledged privately, a feeling. They talked for 2 hours. This surprised her. She was not usually someone who lost track of 2 hours in conversation. She had things to do, places to be, a schedule that operated on the budget of someone who couldn't afford to let time become a luxury. But the coffee cooled and she finished it anyway, and then they got second cups without discussing it, and the conversation moved the way good conversations did when you weren't monitoring them. Not in a straight line, but in loops and tangents that kept returning to something central. He asked about the tutoring center, not in the polite way people asked about jobs they had no actual interest in, but with specific questions that meant he'd retained details from the week before. He asked about Jerome, which she hadn't expected, and she found herself telling the whole story, not the summary version she gave to people she didn't think would get it, but the actual story, with the parts that were frustrating and the parts that were funny and the parts that had made her sit in her car after work for 10 minutes before she could make herself go home. He told me last week that he finally gets fractions, she said. But then he said he still thinks it's suspicious that the bigger the bottom number, the smaller the piece. That is objectively suspicious, Adrian said. Right? I couldn't argue with him. I just said, you're not wrong, but it works, and he accepted that. Pragmatic. Deeply. She turned her cup in her hands. He's one of those kids who's going to either be fine or have a very hard time, and the difference is going to come down to whether anyone keeps showing up for him. And you keep showing up. I keep showing up, she said, not proudly, just factually. He looked at her across the table with an expression she couldn't quite categorize, not pity, which she would have recognized immediately and resented, something more like attention, the kind that wasn't performing itself. What? She said. Nothing, he said. You're just, he thought about it, more serious than I think you let most people see. She considered this. I'm serious about things I care about, she said. People mistake that for being generally serious. It's not the same. What are you not serious about? She thought about it. Terrible television, she said. I watch a significant amount of terrible television completely without shame. Define terrible. Reality competition shows where the stakes are objectively meaningless. Dating shows where everyone is inexplicably beautiful and inexplicably bad at communicating. One time I watched 6 hours of a show where people competed to see whose gingerbread house was most structurally sound. That sounds extremely good, she said. It was extremely good television. He laughed, and the laugh was genuine. Not the polished kind that people produced in social situations to indicate they were having a good time, but the kind that happened when something actually caught you. It changed his face in a way that made him look less like someone who managed things and more like a person. She noticed this. She filed it in the part of her mind that she was pretending was not keeping detailed records. The thing about Adrian, across the space of that second meeting, was that he didn't try to resolve her. Some people, when they encountered someone who had been through hard things, had an instinct to fix the narrative, to find the bright side, to offer the reframe, to make the difficult parts into something that led usefully toward growth or learning or some other word from a self-help book spine. Emily had encountered enough of this to recognize it immediately and to have a specific, weary response to it. Adrian didn't do that. When she talked about hard things, he just listened to them be hard. He didn't reach for the silver lining. He didn't tell her she was stronger for it. He just received the information and stayed with it, which was rarer than it should have been. She didn't know what to do with someone who didn't need her to be okay about everything. The second Tuesday became a third. The third became a Saturday afternoon walk through a neighborhood neither of them knew well, which had been his suggestion, framed as something casual. He'd read about a good bakery somewhere around Ashfield Street. Did she want to find it? They found it, and it was good, and they walked back the long way without deciding to, past a park where a group of older men were playing chess on the concrete tables with the aggressive focus of people conducting serious business. They stopped to watch for a few minutes, standing side by side with their paper bakery bags. "Do you play?" she asked. "Badly," he said. "Marcus is already better than me, which I'm choosing to take as a parenting win." "You taught him?" "My father taught me. I figured it was worth passing on even if the skill level wasn't there to back it up." "Is your father—" "He died 4 years ago," Adrian said. "Not heavy, just placed. He was one of those people who was very bad at resting. I think not resting was what got him in the end. Heart, at 63. "I'm sorry," she said. "Me too." He watched the chess players for a moment. He would have been very good at being a grandfather. That's the part that still gets me sometimes. Not having him, I've had time to adjust to that. It's Marcus not getting to have him. Emily thought about her own father, the one who had left at 9, and whom she had spent years constructing logical reasons for, until the logic stopped being something she needed. "My grandmother is the one who raised me after my dad left," she said. "She's 74 and still has opinions about everything I do." "She sounds significant." "She's the most significant person in my life," Emily said, without hesitation. "She's also exhausting and correct about more things than any person has a right to be." "The most important people usually are," he said. They walked. The afternoon light was doing its late September thing, going golden and slightly sideways, making ordinary streets look like something from a different era. Emily noticed it, and then noticed that she was noticing it, which was something she hadn't done in a while, been in a moment long enough to actually register what it looked like. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "You keep asking if you can ask things," he said. "You can just ask." "I know. I'm working on it." She watched the sidewalk for a step. "What do you actually do?" "For work." "Daniel told me you run a business, but he was weirdly vague about it." "Tech and development mostly," Adrian said. "I have a few things going." "What kind of things?" "Software infrastructure, some real estate on the side, some early-stage investments." He said it with the slightly deflecting quality of someone who was underplaying something, which she registered but didn't push on, because she knew what it felt like to underplay things, and she'd learned to give people that room. "You sound like you're describing a retirement hobby," she said. "It's more than a hobby," he admitted, "but I don't like leading with it. People change when they know—" He paused. "When they know the specifics of what someone has. They interact with the specifics instead of the person." She understood this differently than he probably intended her to, but she understood it. "I have the opposite problem," she said. "People learn the specifics of what I don't have and interact with those instead." He looked at her sideways. "I know," he said. "I've been thinking about that." She didn't ask what he meant. Some things were better left in the space where they landed. The weeks that followed had a texture she hadn't expected. Not romantic in the formal sense, not pressing toward anything in particular, just a steady accumulation of time spent in someone's company that didn't feel like work. He texted about mundane things sometimes, once about a book he'd read that had made him furious, once with a picture of a lunch Marcus had requested that had turned out structurally unsound, once just to ask if she knew anything about water heater warranties because his had gone out and Google was giving him 17 conflicting answers. She texted back. She didn't analyze the frequency. She was not keeping track. She was absolutely keeping track, and the track showed that she had stopped dreading her phone the way she used to. That specific low-level dread of things coming at you through a screen. Bills, messages from numbers you recognized but didn't want to. Notifications that were always about something that needed fixing. Now, sometimes her phone had things on it that were just pleasant. The novelty of this was something she was not ready to examine directly. Her grandmother, whose name was Rose, and who had opinions about everything Emily did, and had been right about most of them across the span of Emily's entire life, noticed the phone behavior within approximately 4 days. "You've been smiling at that thing," Rose said one evening, not looking up from her program, which was a nature documentary she watched with the focus of a person studying for an exam. "I smile at things," Emily said. "Not like that." "Like what?" "Like you forgot you were doing it." Rose turned a page in the TV guide she kept, even though it was completely unnecessary in the era of on-screen menus, because she'd kept one for 40 years and didn't see the reason to stop. Is it that man? What man? The man someone you mentioned and then refused to discuss for 3 weeks. Emily set her phone down. His name is Adrian. What does Adrian do? He runs a business. Rose looked up from the TV guide. She had the eyes of a woman who had raised a granddaughter alone and learned to read every version of evasion Emily had ever attempted. What kind of business? Tech stuff, software. Rose returned to the guide. Is he good to you? We've just been spending time together. It's not... I didn't ask what it was or wasn't. I asked if he was good to you. Emily thought about the water glass being refilled without ceremony, the coffee that was already there when she arrived, the question about Jerome that proved he'd listened, the way he sat across from Devlin Marsh and said nothing and let her say what she needed to say, which was somehow more powerful than if he'd said something himself. Yeah, she said, he's good to me. Rose nodded once with the decisiveness of someone filing information. I want to meet him. Grandma, I'm 74 years old. I don't have time to be indirect about things. She turned a page. Bring him for dinner. We're not at that... You've been smiling at your phone for 3 weeks. You're at that stage. Another page. Next Sunday. I'll make the chicken. Emily opened her mouth to argue and then looked at her grandmother's profile, which had the absolute certainty of a woman who had spent 7 decades being right about things and had no particular interest in being argued with. I'll ask him, she said. Rose nodded. Good. She asked him on a Thursday. She did it via text, which she knew was cowardly, but which gave her more control over her own face during the waiting period. My grandmother wants to have you for dinner Sunday. I want to be clear, this is entirely her idea, and you are not obligated. The response came in under 2 minutes. I'd like that. Should I bring anything? She stared at the message. Not, are you sure? Or, let me check my schedule, or any of the reasonable deflections a person could make when invited to meet someone's grandmother after a few weeks of coffee and walks. Don't bring anything fancy, she wrote back. She'll think you're showing off. Noted. What is she like? Emily thought about it. Yellow tulips. But that's probably Sunday, he sent back before she'd finished the sentence. She read that single word for slightly longer than was warranted. Then she put her phone down and went to do the dishes, which needed doing and which gave her hands something to do that was not hold her phone and read one word too many times. Sunday came with the particular morning quality of a day that has been assigned too much significance, where you wake up knowing something is different about it before you've decided whether that's good. Emily cleaned the apartment with the focused energy of someone who was definitely not nervous, which meant she cleaned things that were already clean and reorganized the shelf by the door twice and changed her clothes 3 times before settling on what she'd originally put on. Rose sat in her chair and watched all of this with complete composure. You're going to wear a hole in the rug, she said. I'm not pacing. You cleaned the inside of the microwave. It needed it. Emily. Rose's voice was gentle in the specific way it became when she was being serious about something. Sit down. Emily sat down on the couch. You like this man, Rose said. She started. Don't argue with me about it. I'm not asking. I'm telling you that I can see that you like this man, and that it's scaring you, and that I need you to hear something from me before he gets here. Emily was quiet. You have spent a very long time, Rose said, making yourself smaller so that people would be less likely to notice you and then leave. I have watched you do this, and I have not known the right time to say it, but I think now is the time. She folded her hands in her lap. Small doesn't protect you from anything, baby. It just makes less of you available to the world. That's not the same as safe. Emily looked at her grandmother's hands, which were the hands of someone who had spent 74 years doing things with them. The wedding ring that she still wore, although Rose's husband had been gone for 11 years. I'm not making myself small, Emily said, and heard how weak it sounded. You told a man he could leave before dinner started, Rose said, because you thought it would be easier if he left right away. That's not openness. That's preemptive retreat. The doorbell rang. They both looked at the door. Rose stood up with the unhurried certainty of a woman who had been correct about things her whole life and was prepared to be correct about more. Go get the door, she said, and stand up straight when you do it. Emily stood up straight. She went to the door. Adrian stood in the small hallway outside their apartment with a bunch of yellow tulips that he was holding the way people held flowers when they were slightly unsure of the etiquette, and a bottle of wine that was unremarkable enough that she recognized he'd thought about it, and a look on his face that was not the look of someone doing a social obligation, but of someone who had actually wanted to be here. She looked at the tulips. Where did you find yellow tulips in late September? Took some effort, he said. She stepped back to let him in, and he came inside. And the apartment was small, and the ceiling was slightly lower than it needed to be, and one wall had a paint color she and Rose had argued about, and there was a bookshelf that was slightly too full, and a television that was slightly too large for the space. And Adrian looked around at all of it the way someone looked around when they were actually seeing a place rather than evaluating it. Rose appeared from the kitchen doorway, wiping her hands on a dish towel. She looked at Adrian with the precise and unhurried evaluation of someone who had decades of practice separating the real from the performed. Mrs. Carter, Adrian said, and he said it like he'd thought about it, like he'd made a choice about the right way to address her. Thank you for having me. Rose looked at him. She looked at the tulips. She looked at Emily. Come in, she said finally. Dinner's almost ready. You can put those in the blue pitcher on the counter. She turned back to the kitchen. Adrian looked at Emily with the expression of someone who wasn't sure whether that had gone well. She knows where every pitcher is in that kitchen, Emily said quietly. She told you which one specifically. That means you passed round 1. How many rounds are there? With my grandmother? She started toward the kitchen. You'll know you've passed the last one when she starts giving you opinions you didn't ask for. And if she doesn't? Then she's decided you're not worth the investment, Emily said. He nodded, absorbing this, and followed her into the kitchen, where Rose was stirring something with the authority of a woman who had been the final word in this household for a very long time and had no plans to change that. The evening that followed was not seamless. Rose asked questions that were pleasant on the surface and architecturally more complicated underneath. About Adrian's son, his work, where he'd grown up, what his father had been like, what he thought about 3 separate topics that were actually tests disguised as conversation. Adrian answered all of them without performing, which was the thing, Emily realized, that she kept coming back to. He just answered. He was wrong about one thing and admitted it immediately when Rose corrected him. He asked Rose questions back, genuine ones, and listened to the answers with the same quality of attention Emily had noticed from the beginning. Marcus came up. Adrian described the anglerfish breakfast, and Rose laughed the way she laughed when something genuinely surprised her, short and real. Emily sat at that small table in that small kitchen and watched her grandmother laugh at something Adrian had said, and felt something shift in the architecture of herself in a way that was quiet and significant and slightly terrifying. Rose caught her eye across the table. She said nothing. She didn't need to. She just looked at Emily the way she had when Emily was 9 years old and afraid, and Rose had said very simply, "You are not alone in this house." The meaning was the same now. The application was different. Later, after the dishes were done and Adrian had gone home, late, which neither of them had planned, Rose sat back in her chair and resumed her documentary as though the evening had been entirely ordinary. "He's the real thing," she said, without looking away from the screen. Emily was folding a dish towel. "You can't know that from one dinner." "I knew your grandfather from one conversation," Rose said. "Some things you just know." "That's not—" "He brought yellow tulips," Rose said. "You told him you liked them in a text message, and he found them out of season and brought them to a dinner where he knew he was going to be interrogated." She clicked the volume up slightly on the documentary. "He paid attention. Men who pay attention are not common." Emily set the dish towel down on the counter. She looked at the blue pitcher on the counter, the yellow tulips standing in it, slightly too tall for the space, but there anyway. "Go to bed," Rose said. "You're thinking too loud." Emily went to bed. She lay in the dark and listened to the sounds of the apartment, the radiator doing its irregular thing, the distant traffic, her grandmother's documentary murmuring through the wall. She thought about what Rose had said that afternoon. Small doesn't protect you from anything. It just makes less of you available to the world. She thought about standing up straight at the door. She thought about yellow tulips found out of season by someone who had been paying attention. She turned over in the dark and looked at the ceiling and thought, with the careful precision of someone who had learned to be careful. Maybe. Just maybe. And then she was asleep. The maybe lasted about 3 weeks before something cracked it open. It wasn't a dramatic crack. It wasn't one moment or one conversation. It was the accumulation of small things that Emily had been cataloging without meaning to. The way Adrian remembered details she mentioned once and never repeated. The way he texted on Tuesday mornings because he knew Tuesdays were her longest days at the tutoring center, and a message in the morning made the day start differently. The way he'd looked at her apartment not like someone assessing its deficiencies, but like someone who was genuinely curious about the life lived inside it. She'd stopped telling herself it was nothing. That was the crack. Not telling herself a thing she knew wasn't true anymore. What she hadn't stopped doing was waiting for the other shoe. That particular habit was older and more structural than the self-protective narration she'd been running about Adrian, and it operated at a level below conscious thought, a low hum, always present, that said, "You know how this ends, you've seen how this ends. Don't get so far out on the ice that you can't get back." October moved through the city with its usual indifference, trading out the last warm days for something grayer and more honest. Emily started her night class again, an economics course she'd been putting off for 2 semesters because the timing never worked and the money was always tight. She told Adrian about it on a Wednesday walk, the kind they'd fallen into without formalizing, just a standing practice of walking somewhere on Wednesday afternoons when her shift ended early and his schedule had a gap that he kept clear without explaining why he kept it clear. "What's the course?" he asked. "Macro," she said, which is essentially the study of why money does what it does and why most of it ends up in the same places. "Are you enjoying it?" "I'm finding it clarifying," she said, which was a different thing. There's a difference between knowing abstractly that systems are built a certain way and understanding the actual architecture of how they stay that way. He was quiet for a moment. "That sounds like it could make a person angry." "It does make a person angry," she said. "It also makes a person more precise about what they're angry at, which feels better than just being generally angry at the air." He nodded. She'd noticed he did that. Nodded when he was actually thinking about what she'd said rather than waiting to respond, which was something that took her an embarrassingly long time to identify as unusual because she'd grown so used to the performance of listening rather than the thing itself. "Jerome's taking a math test Friday," she said. "How's he feeling about it?" He said, and I quote, "Miss Emily, I am cautiously optimistic, which is what you say when you don't want to jinx it, but you also don't want to pretend you're not prepared." She kept her face straight for as long as she could manage. "He's 9. "He's going to be a lawyer," Adrian said. "I think so too, and I find it equally terrifying and wonderful." They walked another block in the comfortable silence that had developed between them over the past weeks. Not the silence of 2 people with nothing to say, but the silence of 2 people who didn't need noise to fill the space. The city moved around them. A dog being walked by a small child stopped to investigate something near a fire hydrant with great seriousness. A delivery truck double-parked with the specific confidence of a vehicle that had made this calculation many times and found it worthwhile. "Can I tell you something?" Adrian said. "You keep asking," she said, echoing something he'd said to her weeks ago. "You can just say it." He almost smiled at that. "I have a thing next Saturday. A dinner. It's—" He paused in a way she'd learned to recognize as him choosing words with some care. "It's a work thing. Some people I do business with. It's more formal than I usually prefer." He looked ahead rather than at her. "I'd like you to come, if you want to." She processed this. A work dinner was different from coffee and walks. A work dinner was a context, an introduction, a statement of some kind about what she was in relation to him. She was aware of all of this and aware that he was aware of all of this, and that asking was therefore more than it sounded like on the surface. "What kind of formal?" she said, because it was the practical question underneath which the real answer was being worked out. "Suit jacket formal, not black tie." "Okay," she said. He looked at her. "Okay, you'll come," or "Okay, you understand the dress code." "Okay, I'll come," she said, and kept walking so that he couldn't see her face fully, which was doing something she hadn't authorized it to do. She spent the week before the dinner trying not to think about it too specifically. The dress she had that worked for formal occasions was 3 years old and slightly too tight across the shoulders from a dryer incident. But it was what she had, and she was not going to buy something new for an event that she didn't yet know the meaning of, because buying something new would mean she'd decided it meant something, and she hadn't decided that yet. She was in this particular negotiation with herself on Friday afternoon when her phone rang, and the name on the screen was one she hadn't seen in a year and a half, and would have been entirely happy not to seeing again for considerably longer. She almost didn't answer. She answered. Emily. The voice was bright and calibrated, the social brightness of someone who had decided to be charming before the call connected. It's Lydia. I know, Emily said. Lydia Park had worked at the nonprofit for 2 years before leaving for a position at a firm downtown that paid 3 times as much, which Emily had not blamed her for. What she had eventually stopped forgiving was the way Lydia had spent those 2 years treating Emily with the specific condescension of someone who viewed working with lower-income communities as a line on a resume rather than a reason to get up in the morning. She'd never been outright unkind. Outright unkind would have been easier to name. She'd been the kind of person who made comments that could have been compliments if you looked at them from the right angle being one that required you to contort yourself considerably. I'm in the city this weekend, Lydia said. Some of us are getting together Saturday, dinner at Seren. A pause that performed casualness badly. Devlin is going to be there. He mentioned he ran into you recently. There it was. Emily sat very still for a moment. Seren was a restaurant she knew by reputation. New, expensive, the kind of place that operated as a social signal more than a dining experience. The kind of place Devlin Marsh would choose for the architecture of how it would make other people feel. Saturday doesn't work for me, Emily said. Oh, that's too bad. The brightness recalibrated without missing a beat. We thought it might be nice to all catch up. Devlin said you looked well. Devlin said a lot of things when I saw him, Emily said. Catching up wasn't the main theme. A slight pause. He can be a lot, Lydia said with the tone of someone who found this charming rather than problematic. But he does ask about you sometimes. I think he's always had a soft spot in his way. Emily thought about a gray shirt with the sleeves rolled up, and 6 people laughing, and the specific quality of the silence that fell after someone said the words, bring so little to the table with the confidence of a man stating something obvious. Tell everyone I said hello, Emily said, and hung up. She sat with the phone in her lap for a moment. Then she put it face down on the table and finished making her coffee and stood at the kitchen window looking at the back of the building across the alley, which had fire escapes going up it in a pattern that she'd looked at for 2 years and never particularly thought about. Her grandmother appeared in the kitchen doorway. Who called? Rose said. It was not a question. Nobody important, Emily said. Rose looked at her granddaughter's back with the attention of someone reading a book she'd read before. What did nobody important say? Emily turned around. There's a dinner Saturday. People from before. Devlin's going to be there. Rose's expression did not change dramatically. It didn't need to. The slight tightening around her eyes was enough. And you said? I said I was busy. Good. Rose came to the kitchen and opened a cabinet. You are busy. You have dinner with your young man. He's not, Emily started, and then stopped, because she was about to say, he's not my young man, and the sentence had started to feel like a lie she was tired of maintaining. I have dinner with Adrian, she said instead. Same thing, Rose said, and put the kettle on. Saturday arrived. Emily wore the 3-year-old dress, and it was fine. The shoulder situation was manageable if she didn't reach for anything above her head, which she made a mental note about. She did her hair the way that took longer and was worth it, and she put on the earrings Rose had given her for her 28th birthday, small gold circles that worked with everything. Adrian picked her up at the apartment, which meant he came to the door, which meant Rose answered it before Emily could get there, which Emily had anticipated and accepted as inevitable. Rose held the door open and looked at Adrian for approximately 4 seconds. You look nice, she told him. Thank you, Mrs. Carter. So do you. I know, Rose said. Emily's almost ready. Come in. He came in and stood in the small living room, and Emily could hear them from the bedroom. Her grandmother asking whether Adrian had eaten anything since lunch because she'd made extra rice, and it was right there on the stove, and Adrian saying yes, actually, he'd only had half a sandwich, and if it was no trouble, he would love some rice and the sound of a cabinet opening. Emily stopped in front of the mirror for a moment. She looked at herself. The dress was fine. The earrings were good. Her face was doing something open that she didn't usually let it do before she was in complete control of the evening's variables. She left it open. She went out. Adrian looked up from the small portion of rice Rose had given him, and knowing Rose it was not a small portion, and said, "You look great," in the simple way of someone saying a thing because it was true rather than because it was the correct sentence for the moment. "Thank you," she said, without redirecting or deflecting it. Rose gave her a very small nod of approval from across the room. The dinner was at a hotel that had a restaurant on the upper floor, with the kind of view that reminded you the city was large and intricate, and mostly indifferent to the individual lives happening inside it. The room was full of the particular noise of people performing their professional selves, laughter that was slightly too coordinated, conversations that were partly networking and partly social and navigated that line with varying degrees of grace. Adrian introduced her to people throughout the evening with a consistency that she noticed and cataloged, not as someone he'd brought, not as a friend, not with the vague descriptor that kept options open. He used her full name and then said she runs the after-school tutoring program at the Westfield Center, which was not how she usually described her own job. She usually said, "I work at a nonprofit," and she realized that was how he thought of what she did, with more weight than she'd been giving it herself. She met a man named Gerald who was in development and shook her hand with the hearty enthusiasm of someone who treated every introduction as an opportunity. She met a woman named Constance who was in finance and looked at Emily with brief, precise evaluation before deciding she was interesting and pivoting to a 20-minute conversation about behavioral economics that Emily held her own in entirely due to her current night class, which felt like some kind of karmic payoff for the tuition. She was talking to Constance when she saw Adrian across the room, talking to a man she didn't recognize. And the man said something that made Adrian laugh in the genuine way rather than the social way. And the sight of it, unguarded, across a crowded room, not for her benefit, settled something in her chest that she hadn't known was unsettled. She looked away before he could catch her looking. It was near the end of the evening, when the dinner had broken into smaller conversations and the noise of the room had the looser quality that came with the end of formal things, that it happened. She'd stepped away from the main table for a moment. She needed air that wasn't 60 people's perfume and the particular pressure of being on for 3 hours, and had found a quieter corner near the windows where the city lights were doing their nighttime thing 40 floors below. She didn't hear him approach. She rarely did. "Carter!" She turned. Devlin Marsh was standing 10 feet away, a glass in his hand, wearing a jacket she was certain cost more than her monthly rent, and the expression of a man who had decided something before he walked over. He looked different from the last time she'd seen him. At Marigold, across the table from Adrian, when she'd said what she'd needed to say and watched him recalibrate in real time. He looked less certain of the script. "I didn't know you'd be here," she said. "Gerald's an old friend," he said. "Small world." He looked at her with the measuring quality that she'd once mistaken for interest and later understood was something colder, the assessment of someone calculating what you were worth to them and whether the number was sufficient. "You're here with Cross." "Yes." "Interesting." He moved slightly closer, which she didn't step back from. "I didn't know you two were—" "We are," she said simply. He absorbed this. Took a drink. "He's a private person," Devlin said, with the tone of someone offering information rather than making conversation. "Has a reputation for keeping things close to the chest. Business, personal life, all of it." He paused. "How much do you actually know about him, Emily?" She looked at him steadily. "More than I knew about you." Something moved across his face. "I was 28, he said. "What happened between us? I was an idiot." "You were," she agreed. "But that's not actually what I remember most. What I remember most is that you were deliberate about it. It wasn't careless. You thought about it first." Devlin said nothing. "The things people do carelessly," she said, "I can usually let go of. It's the deliberate ones that stick." She held his gaze. You decided I wasn't worth keeping because I had less money than you wanted your partner to have. And then you said it in front of 6 people on a Thursday night because you wanted there to be witnesses to your standards. Emily, I'm not angry anymore, she said, and realized as she said it that it was true. That's not what this is. I'm just accurate. He was quiet for a moment. In the window reflection, she could see the room behind them, the laughter, the moving figures, the whole orchestrated sociability of it. And in that reflection, she could also see the moment Adrian appeared in the doorway across the room, scanning, and found her. She saw the exact moment he saw Devlin. He didn't cross the room fast. He didn't make a scene of it. He moved the way he did when he was paying close attention to something, with a quietness that was more focused than stillness. He reached her side and stood there, and his hand found the small of her back, light and brief, not possessive, just placing himself in the space. Marsh, he said. The word was entirely neutral. Cross. Devlin looked between them. Some final calculation ran behind his eyes and apparently came up with an answer he'd already known but had needed to verify. Good to see you. Likewise, Adrian said, in the tone that meant the opposite, and everyone present knew it. Devlin looked at Emily one last time. In that look, there was something that might have been regret and might have been something less clean than regret. The look of someone who had made a calculation long ago that had turned out to be wrong by more than they had anticipated. He gave a brief nod. He walked away. The room exhaled around them. Emily looked at the window, at the city 40 floors below, its indifferent and beautiful grid of lights. How long was he? Adrian started. Not long, she said. I had it. I know, he said. I wasn't coming over to intervene. I was coming over because I wanted to be there. She looked at him sideways. He was looking at the city too, both of them at the window now, the party behind them. He asked me how much I knew about you, she said. Adrian was quiet for a moment. What did you say? I said more than I knew about him. She paused. Is there something I should know about you? He turned to look at her directly. There was something in his expression that was complicated in a way she hadn't seen on him before. Not evasion, exactly, but the look of someone who has been carrying something they know they need to put down and haven't quite found the moment for. There are things I should tell you, he said. Okay, she said. Not here. Okay, she said again. They stayed at the window for another minute, the city doing its wordless business below them, and then they went back to the room and finished the evening the way it needed to be finished. And Emily talked to Constance for another 20 minutes about the institutional inertia in financial policy, and Adrian shook hands and said his goodbyes with the efficiency of someone who is good at endings, and then they were in the elevator going down. The elevator was empty. The floors descended on the panel with the soft chime of expensive machinery. There are things I should tell you, he said again, looking at the floor numbers. You said that. I know. I'm saying it again so you know I mean it. She looked at his reflection in the polished elevator doors. Adrian, I don't know everything about you. You don't know everything about me. That's not unusual after 2 months. Some of what you don't know changes context, he said. Then tell me when you're ready, she said. He looked at her reflection. You're very calm about this. I'm not calm, she said. I'm just choosing not to perform the part of the person who's panicking until I have actual information to panic about. The elevator reached the lobby. The doors opened. They walked out into the marble quiet of the hotel lobby, and then through the revolving doors and into the city air, which was cold enough now that their breath was visible. Walk, he said. Walk, she agreed. They walked 2 blocks before either of them said anything. The city at this hour had a different quality than it did during the day. Less transactional, more ambient, the late-night people moving with the particular purposefulness of those who had somewhere to be and had already done the math on the cold. You handled him, Adrian said. Devlin, in there. You didn't need me to say anything. I told you. I know, I'm saying it because... He stopped walking. She stopped too. He was looking at the middle distance with the expression of someone arranging something carefully. When I met you, you told me I could leave before dinner had started, because you'd learned to expect it. And tonight you stood in front of a man who had, his jaw moved once, who had done something deliberately cruel to you, and you said your piece, and you didn't flinch, and you didn't need anyone to rescue you." "I didn't need rescuing," she agreed. "That's the part," he said. "You never needed it. You just needed someone to not leave. Those are different things." She stood on the sidewalk and looked at him in the cold city air and felt the thing she'd been carefully not naming for 2 months settle in her chest like a stone, finding the bottom of water. Not heavy, just exactly as heavy as it was, finally at rest. "Why did you stay?" she asked him. "That first night, you could have— the moment Devlin walked over, you could have made an excuse. You didn't even know me." "I know," he said. "So why?" He was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone stalling, but the quiet of someone being honest with themselves before they were honest with someone else. "Because you were the most unperforming person I'd met in a long time," he said. "And I've been in rooms full of people performing for years. You came in prepared to lose, and you stayed anyway. And you said what you needed to say to a man who'd hurt you in front of a room full of strangers. And you didn't cry, and you didn't need me to fix it. You just—" He looked at her. "You just needed someone to be there. And being there was the easiest thing I'd done in months." The cold moved through the street around them. "I'm going to tell you the thing," he said. "The context thing. I was going to wait, but I don't want to wait anymore." "Okay," she said. "Not tonight," he said. "I want to do it right. Can I take you somewhere this weekend? Not a dinner. Somewhere quiet." "Yes," she said, without the pause she would have inserted 2 months ago. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she was beginning to learn, the one that meant he was surprised by something she'd done and was trying not to show how much. He mostly succeeded. They started walking again. The cold wasn't uncomfortable, just present, and she put her hands in her coat pockets, and he matched her pace exactly, not walking ahead the way some people did, just beside her. 2 blocks from where she needed to catch her bus, she stopped. "I need to tell you something too," she said. "Okay." "I've been waiting for you to turn into something else," she said. "Since the beginning. I've been watching for the moment you turn into—" She made a gesture that was mostly insufficient. "The version I was expecting. The version that finds the exit when things get complicated." He listened. "I'm not waiting anymore," she said. "I noticed I'd stopped and I thought you should know." He was very still for a moment. "Okay," he said, and the word had more weight in it than words usually carried. The bus stop was half a block ahead. They walked to it and stood there in the particular silence of a city bus stop at 11 on a Saturday night, which was somehow more intimate than the restaurant had been, than the hotel had been, than any of the polished contexts of the evening. The bus came. She stepped toward it. "Sunday," he said. "I'll pick you up at noon." "Sunday," she agreed, and got on the bus. She found a seat near the window and didn't look back until the bus pulled away from the curb. Then she looked, briefly, and he was still there at the bus stop, hands in his pockets, watching the bus go the way he had the very first night outside Marigold. She turned back to face forward. Across the aisle, a woman about her age was asleep against the window, her head at the angle of someone who had made the calculation that dignity mattered less than rest. 3 rows back, a man was on his phone, having a conversation in a low voice about something that sounded urgent but probably wasn't. The bus moved through the city with its usual reliable plodding, hitting every light badly, stopping and starting. Emily sat with her coat still buttoned and her hands in her lap, and thought about a man standing at a bus stop watching her go, and about the thing she'd said, "I'm not waiting anymore," and about the thing he'd said he needed to tell her, the context thing, the thing she didn't know yet. She thought about what Devlin had said. How much do you actually know about him? She thought about this dinner at Marigold, the way Adrian had ordered the same thing she ordered, the deflecting way he'd described his work, tech and development mostly, some real estate on the side, and the slight underplaying quality of it. And Devlin tonight. He's a private person, has a reputation. She thought about the hotel, 40 floors up, the kind of event that people attended because the people attending it were a certain kind of people. She thought about Constance in finance, who had shaken her hand with more interest than most people in finance showed toward nonprofit workers. She thought about Gerald, who treated every introduction like an opportunity. She thought about all of these things in the specific way you think about pieces of a picture when you're starting to suspect the picture is larger than the frame you've been looking at. The bus made its stop 3 blocks from her apartment. She got off into the cold and walked, hands in her pockets, the familiar streets doing their familiar thing around her. She thought, Sunday. She thought, he said he'd tell her. She thought with a calm that surprised her a little. Whatever it is, it'll be what it is. She let herself into the apartment. The light in the living room was still on, which meant Rose had waited up disguised as someone who had simply not yet gone to bed. The television was on at low volume. "You're home," Rose said without looking away from the screen. "I'm home." "How was dinner?" "Good." She took her coat off. Devlin was there. Rose looked away from the television. "What happened?" "I said what I needed to say," Emily said. "And then Adrian was there, and we left." Rose studied her granddaughter's face with the precision of 74 years of close attention. "You look different." "I'm the same." "You look like a person who's made a decision," Rose said. "That's different from before." Emily hung her coat on the hook by the door. She looked at the blue pitcher on the kitchen counter, visible through the doorway. Rose had kept the tulips, which had lasted longer than tulips usually did. They were turning at the edges now, the yellow going slightly papery, but they were still there. "He wants to tell me something Sunday," Emily said. "Something about himself, something he's been—" She searched for the right word. "Holding back." Rose was quiet for a moment. "Are you worried?" Emily thought about it honestly. "No," she said, and found that she meant it. "I think I should be, but I'm not. That's the strange part." "That's not strange," Rose said. "That's what it feels like when you trust someone." She returned to the television. "Go to bed. You look tired." Emily went to bed. She lay in the dark and looked at the ceiling and did not run through the possibilities of what Adrian needed to tell her, which was new and slightly disorienting. The absence of the spiral she would have run 6 months ago. The catastrophizing, the preemptive grief. She was just still, in the best way that stillness could be. Outside, the city kept its usual hours. The radiator did its thing. Her grandmother's television murmured through the wall for another 20 minutes and then went quiet. Emily closed her eyes. Sunday, she thought. She slept. He picked her up at noon exactly, which she'd expected, and he was driving a car she hadn't seen before. Not the practical dark sedan he usually drove, but something quieter and more expensive. The kind of vehicle that didn't announce itself, but that you noticed anyway, the way you noticed well-made things that weren't trying to be noticed. She got in without commenting on it. He drove them out of the city, which she also hadn't expected. She'd assumed somewhere quiet meant somewhere tucked into the neighborhood, a park maybe, or the kind of coffee place that was empty on Sunday mornings. Instead, they went through the tunnel and out onto the highway heading north, the city receding in the passenger mirror until it was just a suggestion of itself against the gray November sky. "Where are we going?" she said. "There's a place I go sometimes when I need to think," he said. "About an hour out. Is that okay?" You could have mentioned this was an excursion. Would you have said yes as easily? She considered this. "Probably," she said, "but I would have brought better shoes." He glanced at her feet. She was wearing the same shoes she always wore, functional, worn at the heels, polished carefully. "They're fine," he said. "You don't know where we're going." "It's not rough terrain," he said. "I promise." They drove north through the kind of landscape that the city forgot existed. Towns that were mostly gas stations and diners, and the particular architecture of places that had been built for function rather than aesthetics, fields going brown and dormant in the November way, sky doing its wide and non-committal thing overhead. Emily watched it through the window and didn't feel the need to fill the quiet, which was its own kind of evidence of something she'd stopped pretending not to notice. She asked about Marcus, because Marcus was always a reliable subject and also because she genuinely wanted to know. "He had a crisis on Thursday," Adrian said. "What kind of crisis?" "Philosophical. He told me that he wasn't sure if he was a morning person or a night person, and that not knowing this was making it hard to understand himself." Emily turned from the window to look at him. "He's 7. "He's extremely 7, Adrian said. "I told him that most people don't figure that out until they're adults, and he said that was a problem with adults that he intended to solve before he became one. That's either deeply healthy or deeply concerning." Both, Adrian said. Definitely both. She smiled at the windshield. How did you leave it? I told him we could try an experiment, go to bed earlier for a week and see if mornings felt different. He agreed to the scientific method, which was the only negotiating language he'd accept. Results? Still collecting data, he said. He's keeping a log, with a pencil, in a notebook, because he decided digital logging had integrity issues. She laughed, and it came out full and unguarded, and she felt him hear it the way she'd learned he heard things, not performing a reaction, just registering it. They drove another 20 minutes into country that was genuinely country now, the highway giving way to a 2-lane road that moved through trees beginning to let go of their last leaves. He turned onto a gravel road she wouldn't have noticed, and then into a lot beside what turned out to be a reservoir, large and gray-green and entirely still in the November light, surrounded by trees on 3 sides and a walking path that disappeared around the far bend. They got out of the car. The air was colder here than in the city, the real cold, the kind with honesty in it. I told you it wasn't rough terrain, he said. You did, she agreed, looking at the water. They started walking the path, not talking immediately, just moving beside each other in the cold. The reservoir was beautiful in the way that large, still bodies of water were in November. Not the easy beauty of summer, but something starker and more permanent feeling. I used to come here with my father, Adrian said. He found it. I don't even remember how. Some research project for a company that was considering buying land out here, and it fell through, but he'd driven out to look at the site and found the reservoir by accident. He brought me the following weekend. I was probably Marcus's age. What did you do out here? Walked. Mostly he talked and I listened. He was good at talking while walking, said he could think better when his feet were moving. He looked at the water. I find the same thing. I don't know if I inherited it or just copied it. Probably both, she said. He looked at her sidelong. Probably both, he agreed. They walked another stretch of path before he said anything else. The trees gave some shelter from the wind, but not all of it. A consistent cold presence that made the walking purposeful. My company, he said, with the deliberateness of someone who has decided to begin, is not a small business. She waited. When I told you it was tech and development, that was accurate but incomplete. He was looking at the path rather than at her. Cross Technologies has about 4,000 employees across 6 offices. We build infrastructure software for financial institutions, primarily the back-end architecture that a significant portion of the country's banking systems run on. We also have a real estate development arm that's been operating for about 5 years, and in the past 3 years I've been doing early-stage investment in several directions. The path curved slightly. They followed it. I'm on the Forbes list, he said, which I realize sounds... I know how that sounds. I'm not saying it to impress you. I'm saying it because it's the most efficient way to convey the scale of the thing I didn't tell you. Emily walked beside him and felt the information landing in her the way large things landed. Not all at once, but in stages, each part finding its place. How long have you known about me, she said, in the sense of knowing who you are while I didn't? Since the first dinner. Daniel didn't tell you to hide it? Daniel doesn't know I've been not mentioning it. It's just something I do. He stopped walking. She stopped too. He turned to face her, and his expression was the most undefended she'd seen on him. Not anxious exactly, but exposed in a way that cost him something. I stopped leading with it a long time ago because when I do, the conversation changes. Every time. People hear a number and they start talking to the number instead of to me. And I'd had enough of that. He paused. And then I met you, and you were the first person in a long time who was just talking to me. Not managing me or performing for me or calculating something. You told me I could leave before dinner started because you'd decided I probably would. You weren't trying to hold on to something. You were just there. He looked at her. I didn't want to change that. She held his gaze. The reservoir was still behind her, the cold moving through the trees with its steady patience. Were you ever going to tell me? She said. Yes, he said without hesitation. When? When I was sure it wouldn't change what you were doing. What was I doing? Deciding whether to trust me, he said, And I didn't want you deciding whether to trust the money. I wanted you deciding whether to trust me. She turned and looked at the water. It sat there doing what it had been doing for decades before either of them arrived and would continue doing long after, holding its surface, reflecting the sky, indifferent and beautiful. I'm angry, she said. I know. Not as angry as I expected to be, she said, which is also making me angry. That sounds right, he said. She was quiet for a moment. All those times I said things about... She stopped, rearranged. I told you about the second cheapest thing on the menu. Not in those words, but you knew what I was doing. I talked about night classes and the shared apartment, and... She stopped again. You had all of that, and you said nothing. I know, he said. I'm not going to tell you that was the right call because I think by the end it probably wasn't. I held it too long. Yes, she said. You did. He accepted that. Didn't argue it or soften it. The people I've dated, she said, who had money, the thing they did, the specific thing, was use it as a filter. Like wealth was a standard, and you either met it or you didn't, and if you didn't, they let you know. She looked at the water. I spent years being filtered out, being told one way or another that what I had wasn't enough. She paused. And you knew all along that you could have changed that conversation, and you chose not to. I did, he said, because I didn't want to be another version of those people. I didn't want you accepting me because of what I had. I wanted... He stopped himself, then continued. I wanted you to accept me because of what I actually was. And I know that sounds like justification, and maybe it is. Emily stood at the edge of the reservoir path in the cold November air and thought about yellow tulips found out of season, about the way he'd refilled her water glass, about his hand on the small of her back at the hotel, light, brief, not claiming anything, just placing himself in the space, about the way he'd sat across from Devlin Marsh at Marigold and let her say what she needed to say without making it about himself, about the rice her grandmother had offered him, and the fact that he'd said yes without making it a performance of humility. I need to think about it, she said. Okay, he said. That's not me saying I'm done, she said. I need you to hear the difference. I hear it, he said. They stood there for another moment. Then she started walking again, back the way they'd come, and he fell into step beside her. 4,000 employees, she said. Give or take. And Marcus thinks your cooking is acceptable but not exciting. He has said this multiple times. He's committed to the critique. What does he actually know about cooking? He watches a lot of television, Adrian said. He's developed opinions. She shook her head. That kid. I know, he said. And there was something in his voice when he talked about Marcus that was different from every other register he used. Softer and less managed. The voice of someone who loved something without reservation and didn't think about how it sounded. They got back to the car. He opened the passenger door, which he'd done every time without commenting on it, and she got in. He drove back toward the city in the gray afternoon, and she watched the landscape reverse itself through the window, the country retreating and the city advancing, and she thought about the things she'd said. I need to think about it. What she was actually doing was not thinking about it. She was feeling it, which was different. She was letting the information sit in her body and find its arrangement without forcing it into a conclusion before it was ready. This was something she'd had to learn in her 30s, that thinking and feeling were not the same motion, and that treating them as interchangeable was why she'd sometimes arrived at conclusions that were technically correct and emotionally completely wrong. What she felt, underneath the genuine anger, was something that did not move. It was the same thing she'd noticed the night before when she'd said she wasn't waiting anymore. A settled quality, like a stone at the bottom of water. The story had changed in its details. The center of it had not. She thought about that. By the time they reached the city, it was late afternoon, the light going sideways and orange, and Adrian pulled up outside her building and put the car in park. Thank you for telling me, she said. I should have told you sooner. You should have, she agreed. But you told me. She reached for the door handle. Same time Wednesday? He looked at her. You still want Wednesday? I said I needed to think about it. I also said that wasn't me saying I was done. She opened the door. Wednesday, same place. She got out, and she did not look back this time. Not from coldness, but from the particular kind of certainty that doesn't need to check whether it's being followed. She let herself into the building and took the stairs instead of the elevator, 3 flights, which gave her lungs something to do and her mind something to organize around. Rose was in the kitchen when she walked in, doing Sunday meal prep the way she'd done since before Emily was born, methodically, without wasted motion, the kitchen filling with the particular smell of a meal that had been thought about. "Well," Rose said without turning around. Emily hung her coat. "He's a billionaire." The wooden spoon in Rose's hand paused, then continued stirring. "How much of one?" "Forbes list." A longer pause. "Forbes list," Rose repeated. "Yes." "And he didn't mention this." "For 3 months?" Emily said. Rose stirred for a moment in silence. Then she said, "Why?" Emily told her. The whole thing. The reasoning, the history of people interacting with the number rather than the person. The deliberate choice to let her decide without the weight of it. She told it plainly, without editorializing, and Rose listened the way she always listened to important things, completely, without interrupting. When Emily was done, the kitchen was quiet except for the stove. "Are you angry?" Rose asked. "Yes." "Does the anger change anything essential?" Emily leaned against the counter. "That's what I'm working out." Rose turned from the stove. She looked at her granddaughter with the eyes that had been looking at her for 30 years and knew every version of her face. "Tell me what didn't change." Emily thought about it. She didn't rush the answer because Rose would know if she rushed it. "The way he is with Marcus," she said. "The way he listened when I talked about Jerome. The way he sat at Marigold and didn't try to fix anything, he just stayed. The way he found yellow tulips in September." She paused. "The way he answered your questions at dinner without performing. The way he ate your rice." Rose raised an eyebrow very slightly. "The rice?" "He didn't say he wasn't hungry, to be polite. He said he'd only had half a sandwich and he'd love some." Emily looked at the stove. "That was real. Nobody performs that." Rose turned back to her cooking. "No," she said. "They don't." The weeks that followed had a different texture than the ones before. Not worse, but more honest, which sometimes felt like the same thing and wasn't. Emily had always known the difference between a connection that felt good and a connection that was true, and she'd learned that the truest ones were usually the most uncomfortable to be inside, because they required you to actually be there, all the way, without the comfortable distance of uncertainty. She was there now, all the way. And it was, as she'd suspected it would be, simultaneously the best and most exposed she'd felt in years. She met Marcus on a Saturday in November, which had been Adrian's suggestion, phrased carefully. Not as a milestone or a statement, but as a practical fact. Marcus had seen the bakery bag from Ashfield Street and wanted to know where it was from, and if Emily was free Saturday morning, they could walk there together. She was free. Marcus Cross was exactly what 7 years of Adrian's description had prepared her for, and also not that at all. He was small for his age, which had clearly not affected his confidence, with his father's eyes and a way of looking at things that was assessing in a manner that seemed older than it had any right to be. He shook Emily's hand when they were introduced with the formality of someone who had decided this was the correct greeting and would not be argued out of it. "My dad said you teach kids," he said. "I help them with schoolwork," she said. "Do you like it?" "I do." He considered this with the seriousness of someone weighing testimony. "My dad is very boring at math," he said. "He gives me the right answers, but he's not good at explaining." "Marcus," Adrian said. "I'm not saying it to be mean," Marcus said. "It's an observation." He looked back at Emily. "Are you good at explaining?" "I've been told I'm decent at it," she said. "By who?" "A kid named Jerome who thinks math is a conspiracy." Marcus's eyes sharpened with immediate interest. "A conspiracy against what?" "People who are good at other things." Marcus thought about this for approximately 4 seconds. "That's actually a reasonable hypothesis," he said. "I'm not saying it's correct, but it's reasonable." "Jerome would appreciate you saying that." "I have opinions about math," Marcus informed her. mostly about fractions. Same, she said. Something in his expression shifted slightly, a degree of openness that she recognized as trust being extended cautiously on provisional terms, which was exactly the right pace for a 7-year-old who had learned, one way or another, to be careful about who he let into the specific circle that was his and his father's. They walked to Ashfield Street. Marcus held his father's hand for the first 2 blocks and then let go, which Emily observed and said nothing about. He walked between them on the sidewalk with the authority of someone who had decided his position in the arrangement. At the bakery, he ordered a cinnamon roll, which he ate with focused attention, and then he informed Emily that the icing-to-roll ratio was slightly off, but that the structural integrity of the roll itself was excellent. "Where did you learn the phrase structural integrity?" she asked. "From the gingerbread competition show," he said. She looked at Adrian over Marcus's head with an expression that said she had something to tell him. He looked back with an expression that said he suspected he already knew. "That's a very good show," Emily said to Marcus. He looked at her with something that was almost, not quite, but almost, a smile. "Dad said it was too much television." "He's wrong," she said. "I'm standing right here," Adrian said. "You're wrong," Marcus agreed. They walked back through the neighborhood in the thin November sun, and Marcus told her about the anglerfish, unprompted, in considerable detail, and with the evangelical fervor of someone who had found a subject they felt the world was not sufficiently aware of. She listened to all of it with genuine attention, asking questions that he answered with increasing enthusiasm. And at some point during the discourse on deep-sea bioluminescence, she felt Adrian's hand find hers and stay there, and she let it. Marcus did not comment on this. He was mid-sentence about light-producing bacteria and was not available for comments. December arrived with its particular insistence. The city put up its lights, which it did every year, and every year it was slightly too much and also exactly right. Emily finished her economics class and got a B+, which she told Rose first and Adrian second and Jerome third. Jerome responded by demanding to see the grade, examined it with the seriousness of a peer reviewer, and said, "That's good, not perfect, but that's honest." She told Adrian this that evening on the phone, and he was quiet for a second and then said, "Jerome is going to be a federal judge." "I keep changing my prediction," she said. "Lawyer, senator, federal judge." "All 3, he said, sequentially. She was in her bedroom with the lights off, lying on her bed, talking on the phone in the dark, the way she hadn't done since she was a teenager, and she was aware of this and felt no need to be self-conscious about it. "Marcus asked me about you today," he said. She waited. "He asked if you were going to keep coming around," Adrian said. "What did you say?" "I said I hope so and that it was somewhat up to you." A pause. He thought about it for a while and then said, "She explained the anglerfish thing to me 3 different ways until I actually got it. Keep her." Emily was quiet for a moment. "Keep her," she repeated. "He has a way with words." "He does." She looked at the dark ceiling. "What did you say?" "I said I was trying," Adrian said. She held the phone for a moment in the dark, the radiator doing its thing, the city outside the window doing its thing, her grandmother's television murmuring through the wall. "You're doing okay at it," she said. "Yeah?" "Yeah," she said. Christmas came. This was the part she hadn't anticipated. Not the season itself, but the question of it. The how does this work of a life that had been 2 separate lives, and was now, in some acknowledged but still unformalized way, becoming something more complicated and more real. Adrian didn't push. This was one of his qualities that she'd come to understand was not passivity, but choice. He didn't push because he'd decided that the pace of something real should be set by its own weight rather than by impatience. He mentioned Christmas the way you mentioned weather, practically, in terms of what Marcus wanted to do, what the week would look like. He did not frame it as an invitation or a test. She mentioned it to Rose on a Tuesday evening, and Rose said simply, "Invite them for Christmas Eve dinner." "Grandma." "It's dinner," Rose said. "I'll make the chicken and the greens and the sweet potato thing Marcus liked last time." Emily stopped. "When did Marcus have the sweet potato thing?" Rose looked up from her program. "He came by with his father 2 weeks ago when you were at your night class review session. I fed them dinner." "You—" Emily stared at her grandmother. You had them for dinner and didn't tell me. You were studying, Rose said. There was nothing to tell. There was absolutely something to tell. The boy needs feeding, Rose said, and Adrian asked if I needed anything fixed around the apartment, and I showed him the second burner. Emily thought about the second burner, which had been broken for 9 months. She thought about her grandmother's landlord who kept not sending someone. Is it fixed? It's been fixed for 2 weeks, Rose said. We've been using it. Rose. Emily. Her grandmother met her gaze with complete serenity. That man came to my door with a 7-year-old who shook my hand and asked about my health. He fixed my stove burner. He ate dinner without checking his phone once. She returned to her program. Invite them for Christmas Eve. Emily stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment, processing the fact that a relationship she was still being careful about had apparently been conducted with considerably less caution by both her grandmother and a 7-year-old while she wasn't present. She texted Adrian. My grandmother has apparently been feeding you behind my back. The response came quickly. The sweet potato thing is exceptional. Marcus has been asking about it since. She wants you both for Christmas Eve. A pause. Then, we'd like that. Marcus is going to ask her to teach him the sweet potato thing. I'm warning you in advance. She'll love that. I know, he wrote. That's why I'm letting him ask. She put her phone down and looked at the second burner on the stove, which was, in fact, working. She turned it on. A clean blue flame appeared immediately, steady and reliable. She turned it off. She thought about the 8 months she'd spent working around a broken thing because the system for fixing it kept failing, and she'd gotten used to compensating. She thought about how you could get so used to working around broken things that you stopped noticing they were broken, just incorporated the inconvenience into the routine, made the routine around it. She thought about the version of herself who had said, "You can leave before dinner even started," and the version of herself standing in this kitchen now, using a stove burner that worked because someone had noticed it didn't and done something about it without making it a grand gesture or an invoice. Christmas Eve was loud in the way that small apartments became loud when they were full of people who didn't usually share the space. Rose had made more food than 4 people could eat, which was her way of communicating that the evening mattered, because Rose expressed care through quantity and had done so for 74 years with zero intention of changing. Marcus arrived wearing a collared shirt that he had clearly put on himself and spent 0 time making neat, and he shook Rose's hand again, seriously, and then asked immediately if he could help with the sweet potato thing. Rose handed him a spoon. Emily stood in the doorway between the kitchen and the living room and watched her grandmother and a 7-year-old she'd known for 6 weeks stir something together at the stove. Rose narrating with the precision of someone who had made this dish 1,000 times and knew exactly which details mattered. Marcus nodding and asking clarifying questions that Rose answered with the patience she had always reserved for people she'd decided were worth the investment. Adrian appeared beside her, 2 inches to her left, close enough that their arms were touching. He's going to make her teach him everything she knows, he said quietly. She's going to love every second of it, Emily said. I know. He looked at the scene in the kitchen. She reminds me of my father, the way she treats information like a gift worth wrapping carefully. She looked at him sideways. That's a nice way to put it. He had his moments. He looked down at her. So do I, occasionally. Occasionally, she agreed. They stood there in the doorway, the kitchen warm and smelling of everything Rose had made, Marcus asking with great seriousness whether the brown sugar went in before or after the vanilla. Rose saying after, always after, and why do you think that is? Marcus considering this with the focused frown of someone actually working the problem. Emily felt the thing she'd been careful about for months settle into something permanent. Not the butterfly feeling of early days. That had been there, she wasn't going to pretend it hadn't, but something underneath that, foundational, the thing that stayed when the butterfly feelings went about their business. She thought about her grandmother's words from what felt like a long time ago now. Small doesn't protect you from anything. It just makes less of you available to the world. She was not small right now. She was here, completely, in a kitchen full of people she loved, with a man beside her who had found yellow tulips out of season and fixed a stove burner without mentioning it, who had held her hand on a November sidewalk without making it a declaration, who had told her an uncomfortable truth when he could have kept holding it longer. She had been angry about it. She was still, occasionally a small residue of angry about it, But she understood now, not excusing it, just understanding, that some people learned to hide the things that changed how other people saw them, and that this learning came from enough times of watching the thing change something, erasing the person in favor of the circumstance. She understood that because she had done a version of it herself. She had hidden her own insufficiencies the same way. Not lied, but underplayed, edited, presented the version that was slightly easier to accept. They had both walked into that restaurant in October with their most survivable selves forward, and their whole selves held carefully in reserve. The difference was that they'd both eventually brought the rest. "I want to tell you something," she said, low enough that only he could hear. "Okay," he said. "I'm not waiting for it to go wrong anymore," she said. "I want you to know that. I stopped a while ago, but I don't think I said it plainly." He was quiet for a moment. She felt him take a breath. "Okay," he said, and his voice had the same quality it had the night outside the hotel, the word carrying more than its syllables. "That's all," she said. "I just wanted you to have it." In the kitchen, Marcus announced that he believed the sweet potato thing was ready to be tasted for quality control purposes. Rose said that quality control was an excellent instinct and handed him a small spoon. He tasted it with the serious face of someone performing an assessment, and then the serious face broke into something genuine and delighted that he didn't try to manage. "It's really good," he said. "Of course it is," Rose said. Emily laughed. Adrian laughed. The kitchen was warm. The second burner on the stove was on and working. Outside, the city was doing its winter thing. The lights they'd strung for the season catching on the cold air, people moving through the streets with their packages and their plans and their accumulated year of living, all of it ordinary and ongoing, and from the doorway of one small warm apartment in one mid-sized building on one street among thousands, briefly, quietly, beautiful. She leaned very slightly into the arm beside her. He was there. The year turned the way years did, not with the dramatic pivot that the calendar suggested, but gradually, almost imperceptibly, one ordinary day becoming another until you looked back and realized the distance you'd traveled without marking the steps. January came with its particular bleakness, and Emily moved through it the way she moved through things that were hard but not unbearable, steadily, without pretending they were easier than they were, keeping her footing. The economics class had ended, but she'd enrolled in the next one. Jerome had passed his semester exam with a B, which he delivered to her with the composure of someone who had expected this outcome and was prepared to receive congratulations graciously. Rose had developed the habit of calling Adrian on Tuesday mornings, which Emily discovered by accident when she heard her grandmother on the phone and recognized the cadence of the conversation, the specific way Rose talked to people she'd decided were worth talking to, direct and warm and completely without performance. She mentioned it to Adrian. "She calls to check on Marcus," he said, with the tone of someone who had decided this was simply a fact about his life now. "She calls to check on you," Emily said. A pause. "She asks about Marcus first." "That's how she does it," Emily said. "She asks about the thing you love most. If you're okay about that, she knows you're okay." He was quiet for a moment. Yeah, he said. "That's exactly what she does." February was cold in the way that February was always cold. The city stripped of the holiday lights that had made December bearable, running on gray sky and the particular determination of people who had decided to continue existing despite the weather's opinion on the matter. Emily started a second night class, a writing course she'd been putting off for 2 years on the reasoning that she didn't have time, which was partially true and partially a way of protecting herself from wanting something and not getting it. She told Adrian about it on a Wednesday walk, their breath visible in the cold, the city doing its February best around them. "What kind of writing?" he asked. "Non-fiction. Personal essay, mostly." She pulled her coat tighter. "My professor at community college told me I should be writing. I filed it away for later, and later kept not arriving, so I decided to make it arrive." "What are you going to write about?" She thought about it. "What I know," she said, "which is mostly what it's like to be in a room where you're not sure you're welcome. There are a lot of rooms like that." She paused. "More people in them than the people who design the rooms usually account for." He nodded in the way that meant he was actually thinking about it. "You'd be good at that." You haven't read anything I've written. No, he said. But I've listened to you talk for 4 months, and you say true things in ways that don't let you look away from them. That's most of what good writing is. She didn't deflect it this time. She just said, "Thank you," and kept walking. That was new, too. Receiving things without immediately returning them to sender. She was getting better at it. March arrived, and with it a thaw that the city received with the collective relief of a population that had been patient and was now, finally, owed something. The light came back in a way that felt almost aggressive after the gray months, sharp and present and unwilling to be modest about its return. It was March when the thing happened with Daniel. Adrian's brother called on a Thursday afternoon while Emily was at the tutoring center, and she didn't see the missed call until after her last session. He'd left a voicemail, which was unusual. Daniel texted, as a rule, because he decided voicemails were an inefficient use of everyone's time. "Emily, it's Daniel. I know this is coming from left field. I wanted to say thank you. Adrian called me last week and I haven't heard him sound like that in, honestly, maybe ever. So, thanks for whatever you're doing, or just, being there. Okay. This is why I don't leave voicemails." She listened to it twice on the bus home. Then she called him back. "I didn't expect you to actually call," he said, picking up on the second ring. "You left a voicemail," she said. "That seemed like it deserved a phone call." "Fair point." He sounded like Adrian, but warmer, with the slight additional ease of someone who had decided early that life was better lived with less deliberation. "How are you doing?" "I'm good," she said. "What did Adrian say when he called?" A pause. "I probably shouldn't repeat it." "Daniel." "He said..." She could hear him deciding how much to give her. "He said that he didn't know it was possible to be this okay. After everything, after Marcus's mother and the years of just working and not, he said he didn't know this was still available to him." She sat on the bus and looked at the city going past the window and felt something move through her chest that was large and quiet and didn't have a clean name. "He's good to you?" Daniel asked. I know he's not always easy to read." "He's good to me," she said. "He holds things too long sometimes," Daniel said. "He always has. He figures out the right thing to do, and then he waits too long to do it because he's checking the math too many times." "I know," she said. "We've talked about it." "Good." He sounded genuinely relieved. "He needs someone who'll tell him when he's checking the math too many times. I've been doing it for 30 years and I'm tired." She laughed. "I'll take over some of the shifts." "I would appreciate that deeply," Daniel said. She got home still carrying the voicemail in some part of her that was warm and careful with it. Rose was in her chair, her program on, and she looked at Emily's face when she came in and said nothing, just reached over and turned the television down a few degrees. "Good day?" Rose said. "Yeah," Emily said. "Good day." She sat on the couch and Rose passed her the remote, and they watched television together in the easy silence of two people who had shared a small space long enough that silence was not something that needed to be explained or apologized for. After a while, Rose said, without looking away from the screen, "He's going to ask you something." Emily looked at her grandmother's profile. "What?" "Adrian. He's going to ask you something important, soon." Rose turned a page in her TV guide. "I'm not telling you what to say. I'm just telling you so you're not caught off guard." "How do you know?" "He asked me a question last Tuesday," Rose said. "On the phone." Emily stared at the side of her grandmother's head. "What question?" "That's between him and me," Rose said serenely. "I'm just telling you to be ready." "Grandma." "Watch your program," Rose said, and turned the volume back up. Emily sat with this information for the rest of the evening, turning it over without forcing it into a shape, which was something she'd gotten better at over the past several months, letting things be what they were at the pace they needed to be, rather than running ahead of them to the conclusion. She thought about what being ready meant. She thought she was. She thought she'd been ready for longer than she'd admitted to herself, which was probably also something Rose had known before she did, because Rose had been knowing things before Emily did for 30 years and showed no signs of slowing down. The call came 2 weeks later. April 1st, which she would later find either meaningfully ironic or completely coincidental, and she could never quite decide which. He asked if she was free that Saturday. She said yes. He said he'd made a reservation somewhere, and would she trust him on the location? She said she would. She thought about yellow tulips. She spent Friday night being the most normal version of herself she could manage, which meant she cleaned the apartment and then made herself stop cleaning the apartment. And she talked to Rose about ordinary things, and she went to bed at a reasonable hour and lay in the dark for an unreasonable amount of time before she finally slept. Saturday morning, she woke up and it was raining lightly, which felt either atmospheric or inconvenient, depending on how you looked at it. And she decided to look at it as atmospheric because she was entitled to that. He picked her up at 7. Not noon, 7 in the evening, which meant a dinner, which meant he'd thought about the symmetry of it. She was wearing a dress she'd bought in March, blue, a different shade than the navy one from the first dinner, and it fit correctly across the shoulders, which she'd checked twice in the mirror and once more in the window reflection before she stopped. She knew where they were going before the car turned onto the street. She recognized it from a block away. The particular angle of the sign, the same low light coming through the same windows, the same understated quality of a place that had been trying the right amount since before either of them walked into it on a Tuesday in October. Marigold. He opened the door. She went in. The host took them to a table, not the same corner table as before, a different one, slightly more central, the kind of table you sat at when you weren't looking for the exit. She sat down. "You brought me back here," she said. "I wanted to come back here," he said. "Why?" He looked at the table for a moment, then at her. "Because this is where it started, and I wanted to come back to where it started when I knew what it had become." He said it plainly, without decoration, the way he said important things, directly, without softening them with extra words. She looked at him across the table. This man she'd been willing to let walk out a year ago because she'd decided the math on people staying was too poor to bet on. She looked at the way he sat. Not performing anything, just present, occupying the space like a person rather than a position. She thought about everything she knew about him now, the things that had come slowly and the things that had come in one uncomfortable hour at a reservoir, the things she'd figured out herself, and the things he'd told her, and the things Marcus had told her, and the things Rose had observed and reported with her grandmother's particular economy of words. She thought about 4,000 employees and a Forbes list and a man who had ordered the second cheapest thing on a menu because she had. "I want to tell you something first," she said. He waited. "Before whatever you're going to do tonight," she said, "I want to tell you that I know what I am to you. I'm not uncertain about it. I spent a long time being uncertain about whether I was a person someone would choose to stay for, and I'm not uncertain about that anymore. And I want you to know that I know it because you showed me, consistently, over 12 months, without making it a performance." She held his gaze. "I'm saying it first because I want you to know it's already true before whatever happens next." Something crossed his face that she didn't have a word for, but recognized as real. "Okay," he said, and his voice was slightly different than usual. Not unstable, just less managed. "Thank you for that." They ordered. The same waiter, she realized, who had served them that first night. She recognized him by the way he moved, efficient and unhurried, the way good waiters became invisible without being absent. He didn't recognize them. Why would he? They were two people in a restaurant a year later, but she noticed, and it felt like something. They talked through dinner, not about the big things, but the ordinary ones. Jerome, who had decided that his future career was something with patterns, maybe architecture, maybe music, maybe code. "I'm keeping my options open, Miss Emily. I'm 9. Marcus, who had spent 3 weeks campaigning for a dog and had produced a written proposal with supporting research that Adrian had read in full and ultimately said yes to, resulting in a dog named Theorem, whom Marcus had named on the grounds that theorems were things you had to prove over time, and a dog was the same. Rose, who had started texting Adrian memes at an inexplicable frequency, which Adrian received without complaint and occasionally responded to, which Rose apparently found extremely satisfying. "She sent me one at 6:30 this morning," he said. "She's been doing that for 2 months," Emily said. "She says you're the only person who responds with appropriate speed." "It takes less than 30 seconds," he said. "That's what she says." She has a theory about what response speed indicates about a person's character. What's the theory? She hasn't told me. She told me to ask you. He almost laughed. She told me the same thing. She said to ask you. Emily shook her head slowly. She's running an experiment on both of us. Definitely, he said. I'm almost certain we're both in a study. She's been doing versions of this my whole life, Emily said. She designed a situation once when I was 16 that she claimed was accidental, but that I'm now almost certain was a test of my conflict resolution skills. Did you pass? She let me eat the good ice cream after, so I think so. The dinner finished, and the table had the quality of a table at the end of a meal between two people who are not ready for the evening to close but know it's moving toward something. The waiter cleared the plates. Adrian didn't reach for the dessert menu and didn't ask for the check, and Emily noticed this and understood it, and waited. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. What he set on the table was not a box, which she hadn't expected. It was an envelope, cream-colored, her name on the front in handwriting she didn't recognize as his because it was more careful than the handwriting he used for ordinary things, like he'd taken time with it. Open it, he said. She picked it up. The envelope was sealed properly, not just tucked. She opened it carefully the way her grandmother had always told her to open things that someone had taken time to close. Inside was a letter. Handwritten, 4 pages, front and back of 2 folded sheets. She looked up at him. I wrote it 3 weeks ago, he said. I've been writing versions of it since October. That's the one I kept. She looked back at the letter and began to read. She was aware, as she read, of him sitting across the table watching her read, which should have been uncomfortable and wasn't. She was aware of the restaurant around them, the particular low sound of other people's evenings. She was aware of the rain outside, still going, the sound of it against the window beside their table. She read the whole thing. She read the part where he said he'd known from the first dinner that she was the kind of person who made you reconsider the categories you'd built for things. She read the part where he said that Marcus, who did not trust easily and had not since his mother left, had asked him 3 weeks ago why Emily's eyes looked like she was always thinking of a way to be useful, and that he'd spent several days thinking about that because it was the most accurate thing anyone had said about her, and he hadn't found the words himself. She read the part where he said that the billionaire thing, the thing he'd held too long, had been fear in a specific shape, and he was sorry for the specific shape of it, and he understood if she needed that to mean something it hadn't resolved into yet. She read the last page, where he said that he'd spent his adult life making decisions from positions of information and analysis, and that the one thing he was absolutely certain of, without analysis, without checking the math more times than necessary, was that the best version of his life had Emily Carter in it, and he would like her to consider being in it permanently, and he understood that permanent was a large word, and he would give her whatever time she needed with it, and also Marcus had selected the ring and he was prepared to defend the selection on multiple grounds, if needed. She looked up from the letter. He was holding a ring box open on the table. Small, dark blue. The ring inside was not what she would have expected from a billionaire. Not enormous, not trying to make a statement with its size. A single stone, warm-colored, set simply, the kind of thing that was beautiful because it was itself rather than because it was announcing anything. Marcus chose that? She said. He had 4 finalists, Adrian said. He eliminated 2 on the grounds that they were too shiny, which is not the same as good. He chose between the final 2 based on which one looked like something you'd actually wear every day. He paused. His words were, Miss Emily doesn't dress like she's trying to impress anyone. She dresses like herself. The ring should do the same thing. She looked at the ring. She thought about a 7-year-old, now 8, his birthday had been in February, sitting in a jewelry store applying the analytical framework he applied to everything, taking it seriously because he'd decided it was worth taking seriously. He's 8, she said. He's extremely 8, Adrian said. She looked at him. At the letter in her hands, 4 pages of careful handwriting, at the ring in the box on the table, at the man who had sat across from her in this same restaurant a year ago, and when she'd told him he could leave, had simply stayed. I have a question, she said. Okay. The first night, she said, when I told you that you were free to go, before dinner even started. You said later it was interesting. That opening with the exit was interesting. She held his gaze. What did you actually think, right in that moment? Not what you said, what you thought. He was quiet for a moment. The honest answer kind of quiet, not the stalling kind. I thought, he said, that you were the loneliest person I'd ever seen who was also trying to be the most dignified about it, and that someone had done that to you, made you lonely, and then also made you feel like you had to manage it perfectly and apologize for having it. He looked at her steadily. And I thought that was one of the saddest things I'd seen in a long time, and that I didn't want to be another person who confirmed it. The restaurant was quiet around them. The rain was still at the window. She thought about standing outside this building a year ago. Heels that were showing their age, a dress that worked for every occasion, preparing herself for the version of the evening she'd learned to expect. She thought about the version she'd gotten instead. She thought about her grandmother's voice. Small doesn't protect you from anything. She thought about Jerome, who had decided math was a conspiracy and learned to speak it anyway. She thought about Marcus and his written proposal and a dog named Theorem. She thought about a second burner on a stove fixed without announcement, about yellow tulips found in September, about a reservoir in November and an uncomfortable truth delivered without excuses, about 4 months of Wednesday walks and the gradual, unglamorous real work of two people deciding to be known to each other. Yes, she said. He looked at her. Yes, she said again, clearly, without qualification. Something in his face shifted, not dramatically, because he was not a dramatic person, but in the way a thing shifts when it has been held under pressure for a long time and the pressure finally releases. It was not polished or photogenic. It was real, which was better. He took the ring from the box, and she held out her left hand, and he put it on her finger, and it fit, which shouldn't have been surprising, and was anyway, and she looked at it for a moment, the warm stone, the simple setting, exactly itself. She looked up. Marcus is going to say he told you so, she said. He absolutely is, Adrian said. He's been practicing. How long has he known? He helped me plan the evening, Adrian said. 3 weeks ago. He had notes. Of course he had notes. He told me to bring you back to Marigold because... Adrian paused, and she could see him recalling the exact words, because that's where the story started, and stories should have geography. Emily sat with that for a moment. 8 years old with a notebook and a dog named Theorem, and the instinct that stories needed to be located somewhere, that you couldn't just carry them in the air. He's right, she said. He's usually right, Adrian said. It's exhausting and wonderful. She looked at the letter still in her hand. She folded it carefully, the way her grandmother had taught her to fold things that mattered. Not precisely, but with attention. She put it back in the envelope. I'm going to keep this, she said. It's yours, he said. They stayed at the table for a while longer, the kind of staying that was not about waiting for something, but about being in a moment that deserved to be in rather than rushed through. The rain had stopped at some point without either of them noticing. The restaurant had thinned out around them, other evenings completing themselves, other people going toward whatever their Saturday night held. When they finally left, the street outside Marigold was wet and lit with the particular clarity that came after rain. Reflections in the pavement, the colors of the traffic lights extended long and shining on the surface of the street, the city looking like a version of itself that was slightly more vivid than the daytime one. She stood on the sidewalk outside the restaurant, and she was not the same person who had stood here a year ago, which was both obvious and worth saying anyway. She had walked into that restaurant prepared to lose. She had spent most of her adult life prepared to lose, to be found insufficient, to be weighed and found wanting, to be the person the room was already full without. She had made a practice of it, a discipline, because discipline was what kept you from being surprised by the things that always happened. The thing she hadn't accounted for, the variable she'd never included in the math, was the person who showed up specifically because the room wasn't full without her. Not despite her deficits or in spite of her history or because he'd decided her value exceeded her liabilities. Just because she was herself, and himself was a person who knew what he was looking at. My grandmother is awake, she said. I know, he said. I texted her. She looked at him. You texted my grandmother. She asked me to let her know when it was done, he said. She said she wanted to be awake when you got home. Emily thought about Rose sitting in her chair with her TV guide and her muted program, phone in her lap, waiting for a text from a man she'd decided was the real thing from one dinner and 2 Tuesday phone calls and a repaired stove burner, and felt the particular warmth of being known by people who paid attention. "What did she say back?" Emily asked. He showed her his phone. Rose's text read, "Good. Tell her to stand up straight when she walks in, and bring her home safe." Emily laughed, a full, real laugh, the kind that started in the chest and didn't apologize for itself. Adrian smiled watching it, and it was the smile of someone who was exactly where they intended to be. They walked to the car. The city was doing its late Saturday thing around them. Still alive, always alive, indifferent in the way only a city could be and somehow still capable of being beautiful anyway. She thought about all the evenings she'd navigated through the city alone, heading home on buses and walking through cold in shoes that were showing their age, learning to carry her own weight so completely that she'd forgotten you were allowed to share it. She didn't think she'd ever fully unlearn the carrying. It was too deep in her, too structural. But she thought that you could learn, alongside it, to put some things down, to let some of the weight find another set of hands. Not because you couldn't hold it, she could, she'd proven that, but because the choice to not hold it alone was its own kind of strength, the kind she'd been slower to recognize. The drive home was quiet, not the quiet of things unsaid, but the quiet of things settled, which was a different animal entirely. He walked her to the door of the building, which he'd done for months, and she turned at the entrance and looked at him in the streetlight. "I want to tell you something," she said. "You keep having things to tell me tonight," he said. "I have a lot to say when I'm not rationing it," she said. He smiled at that. "I want to tell you that I spent a long time being very efficient at not expecting things. I got good at it. I want you to know that being with you has made me worse at it." He looked at her. "I expect things now," she said. "I expect Wednesday walks and Tuesday texts and a dog named Theorem at Christmas, and Marcus's notes on the geometry of everything, and my grandmother texting you memes at 6:30 in the morning." She paused. "I expect you. That's what I want you to know. I've started expecting you, and I'm not going to apologize for it." He stepped forward and kissed her, right there on the wet sidewalk outside her building, and it was not the first time he'd kissed her, but it was the first time she felt it completely without the residual flinch, the waiting for it to end quality that had lived underneath everything warm for most of her adult life. It was just what it was, present and real, and hers to have. She went upstairs. Rose was exactly where she'd expected her to be. Chair, TV guide, program muted. She looked up when Emily came in, and her eyes went immediately to Emily's left hand, and something in her face did the thing it did when she was feeling something large and had decided not to make a production of it. "Come here," she said. Emily crossed the room and sat on the arm of her grandmother's chair, which she'd been doing since she was small enough to sit there comfortably and had never stopped. Rose took her left hand and looked at the ring for a long moment without saying anything. Then she said, "Yellow." "What?" "The stone." Rose tilted her hand slightly. "It's warm, almost yellow." She looked up. "Like tulips." Emily hadn't noticed. She looked at the ring, the warm stone in the simple setting, and Rose was right. There was something in the color of it that caught the light the way the tulips in the blue pitcher had caught the kitchen light, going gold at the edges. She thought about a man who'd shown up to a first date without a picture, who had found yellow tulips in September, who had, she understood now, all the way, woven a color through a year of small gestures because he'd decided what it meant and then stayed consistent with it. She thought about that being a kind of faithfulness, not grand or announced, just steady, just true. "He's a good man," Rose said. "He is," Emily said. "Not perfect," Rose said. "Not perfect," Emily agreed. "He held things too long, and he checks the math too many times, and he can't plate food properly, and apparently his cooking is acceptable, but not exciting." Rose smiled. "The full one. The one she didn't give to just anything. Neither was your grandfather. First year we were married, he burned dinner 4 times and once set a dish towel on fire, and tried to tell me it was a controlled situation." "Was it?" "Absolutely not," Rose said. "But he stayed in the kitchen and learned." She patted Emily's hand. "That's the whole thing. That's all it ever is. Staying in the kitchen and learning." Emily sat on the arm of her grandmother's chair with her grandmother's hand over hers and looked at a ring that caught the light, warm and almost yellow, and thought about staying. She thought about all the ways she'd learned to leave before she could be left. The practiced exits, the preemptive retreats, the "I'm fine" said before anyone asked. She thought about telling a stranger he could go before dinner started, and the strange, specific miracle of a person who found that interesting instead of reason enough to go. She thought about what it had taken, not from him, but from herself. The daily, unglamorous work of staying when her instincts said to pull back, of showing up for Wednesday walks when she would have found a reason not to 6 months ago, of telling him I'm not waiting for it to go wrong and meaning it, of standing up straight at the door. That was the part nobody talked about, she thought. The love stories always put the weight on the person who stayed, and Adrian had stayed. She would not diminish that. It mattered entirely. But the work she'd done inside herself, the slow undoing of every wall she'd built from reasonable material and reasonable fear, that was its own story. That was maybe the more important one, because a door can be open on one side and locked on the other, and she'd been the lock. She'd unlocked herself. Slowly, imperfectly, with backsliding and second-guessing and more than one conversation with her grandmother that ended with being told to go to bed. But she'd done it, and no one had done it for her. That was worth knowing, worth keeping. Rose clicked the TV volume back on. Her program resumed with the complete serenity of the natural world, some landscape being narrated over in the calm voice of a documentary that had no stakes and was restful because of it. "Go to bed," Rose said. "You look like a person who's had a large evening." "I have had a large evening," Emily said. "It's going to be a large life," Rose said. "You should rest when you can." Emily stood up. She looked at her grandmother, 74 years old, in her chair with her TV guide, the woman who had stepped into the space her father left and filled it completely, without complaint, without requiring gratitude, simply because she was the person who stayed, and staying was what people who loved you did. She leaned down and kissed Rose's cheek. Rose patted her hand once and returned to the documentary. Emily went to her room. She sat on the bed and looked at the ring in the low light, and thought about geography. Marcus's word, or rather Marcus's concept. Stories should have geography. A restaurant where someone told you that you were free to leave and you stayed anyway. A reservoir in November. A kitchen with a second burner that now worked. A sidewalk in the rain. She thought about the places a life was made. Not the grand ones, not the monuments, but the ordinary coordinates where the real things happened. The bus stop. The coffee shop with the mismatched chairs, the doorway between the kitchen and the living room where you stood and watched someone you loved teach a small, serious boy how to make the sweet potato thing. She thought about the year ahead, which she could not map because it hadn't happened yet, and would surprise her in ways she couldn't predict. There would be hard things. She knew this as well as she knew anything. There were always hard things. That was not pessimism. That was just the accurate description of a life being lived. There would be mornings that were difficult, and conversations that cost something, and times when the old reflexes came back and she had to choose, again, to stay present in what was real rather than retreat to what was safe. But there would also be Wednesday walks. There would be Jerome passing tests, and Marcus keeping notes, and Rose sending memes at 6:30 in the morning to a man who responded within 30 seconds. There would be yellow tulips, probably, in various seasons, because that was the kind of person she was building a life with. One who paid attention and stayed consistent with it. There would be a dog named Theorem who still had things to prove. She lay down in the dark and looked at the ceiling and felt, in the quiet, ordinary space of her small room, something she had not felt in a very long time and had not been sure she would feel again. Not happiness exactly, though that was part of it. Something more structural than happiness. The feeling of standing on ground that held. She closed her eyes. Outside, the city ran its permanent and indifferent and somehow comforting hours. Somewhere across town, a man who checked the math too many times was probably still awake, probably thinking, because that was who he was, and she knew who he was, and that knowing was its own form of home. She thought, this is what staying feels like from the inside. She thought, it feels like this. She slept, and the ring caught the low light from the window, warm and almost yellow, and the city went on around the building the way cities did. full of its 10,000 simultaneous stories, its endless geography of small moments that people were living without knowing they'd remember them, and in one small room on one ordinary floor of one building among many, a woman who had once learned to leave before she could be left had finally, completely chosen to stay.